Tonight, we step beyond the shadows and into the light of arcane wisdom. We walk not among assassins and thieves, but among scholars and sorcerers, where the air hums with possibility and every incantation holds the power to reshape reality itself. Tonight, we speak of the Mages Guild. Imagine, if you will, a time when magic was the domain of the privileged few, when spells were whispered only in secret orders, when enchantments were hoarded like gold, when the common folk could only dream of wielding the arcane forces that shaped their world. The Mages Guild changed all of that. It took magic from the hands of the elite and offered it to anyone with the discipline to learn, the courage to practice, and the coin to pay for training. But like all institutions built by mortals, the guild was flawed. Brilliant and ambitious, yes, but also political, fractured, and vulnerable to the very darkness it sought to contain. It rose from the vision of a single man who dared to challenge tradition. It flourished across centuries, establishing halls in every corner of Tamriel. And then, in the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis, when the world needed it most, it crumbled into dust and bitter rivalries. This is the story of how magic was democratized, how knowledge became power, and power became corruption, how two former friends became eternal enemies, locked in a struggle that would span lifetimes and reshape the magical landscape of Tamriel forever. Close your eyes. Feel the crackle of magicka in the air around you. Sense the weight of ancient tomes, the shimmer of soul gems, the cold whisper of enchantments long forgotten. This is the story of the Mages Guild, and tonight, every secret will be illuminated. Chapter 1. Before the Guild, the Psijic Order and the Seeds of Change. Long before guild halls dotted the cities of Tamriel, long before spell merchants hawked their wares in marketplaces, magic belonged to the Psijic Order. On the Isle of Arcane, shrouded in mists that came and went according to no mortal calendar, the Psijics practiced their art in complete isolation from the world. They were counselors to kings, advisors to emperors, masters of magic so profound that common folk could scarcely comprehend it. The order selected its members through complex, ritualized methods that remained mysterious even to those who sought entry. Its purposes were never published. Its goals were never explained. To the Psijics, magic was sacred. It was to be learned slowly, carefully, in intimate covens of master and apprentice. It was not a commodity to be bought and sold, not a service to be advertised in the streets. The very idea would have been abhorrent to them, and for millennia, this was simply how things were. Magic users across Tamriel practiced alone, or in small groups. Hedge wizards wandered the roads, selling minor charms and potions. Court mages served noble houses, their knowledge passing from one generation to the next through apprenticeships. The talented were recruited by the Psijics, if they were fortunate enough to be noticed. The rest, they made do with whatever scraps of knowledge they could find. This system had endured since time immemorial. But in the early years of the Second Era, two young men arrived on Arcane who would change everything. One was a refugee, a former slave who had escaped Lord Girnas's estate with nothing but his father's forbidden gift of literacy and a burning hunger to learn. The Psijics renamed him Vanus Galerion, and they recognized in him a brilliant mind coupled with a warm, generous heart. The other was a nobleman, though his lineage remains disputed to this day. Some claim he was of royal blood. Others suggest darker origins, perhaps even ties to the mysterious Aldmer themselves. The Psijics knew him as Manimarco, and they saw in him a genius equal to Galerion's, but one driven by a heart that beat cold and dark. For years, these two studied together. They learned from the same masters, practiced the same arts, pushed each other to greater heights of magical understanding. They should have been brothers in arcana, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. But magic reveals what lies within. Galerion's studies led him toward light and healing, toward protection and the responsible use of power. He believed magic should serve others, should lift up those who struggled, should be shared freely with any who proved worthy. His childhood had taught him what it meant to be powerless, to watch injustice unfold with no means to stop it. He would not hoard knowledge as Lord Genase had hoarded literacy. Manimarco's path led somewhere else entirely. He became fascinated by necromancy, by the secrets of death and undeath, by the possibility of enslaving souls and commanding the dead. To him, power had no intrinsic morality. Magic was simply magic, a tool to be mastered, and those who flinched from its darker applications were weak-willed fools. Death was not to be feared or respected. It was to be conquered, controlled, made to serve. When Manimarco began experimenting with necromantic spells beneath Kapora Tower, Galerion confronted him. The argument was fierce, passionate. Two former friends hurling accusations in the sacred halls of the Psijic Order. Your wicked mysticism is no way to wield your power, Galerion insisted. You bring horror to the spirit world. Your studies must cease. Manimarco scoffed. He hated the ways of life and peace. He returned to his dark artistry without remorse, without hesitation. Galerion took his concerns to the Psijic elders. Surely they would see the danger. Surely they would act. Manimarco was dabbling in forces that should remain undisturbed. He was entrapping souls, enslaving the dead, casting spells that violated the natural order itself. But the masters of Artaeum dismissed Galerion's warnings. Speak no more of him, they said, and sent Manimarco to the mainland on an errand, believing this was punishment enough. Galerion knew better. On the mainland, Manimarco would be free from oversight, free to gather followers, free to spread his blasphemous teachings to anyone willing to listen. The Psijic Order, in their wisdom and their arrogance, had unleashed something they could not control. This was the moment that changed everything. This was when Vanus Galerion understood that the old ways were broken. The Psijics were powerful, yes, but they had grown complacent. They saw themselves as above the concerns of common folk, removed from the consequences of their decisions. They guarded their knowledge jealously, shared their wisdom only with a select few, and turned a blind eye to threats that didn't directly concern them. If magic was to serve the people of Tamriel, if it was to be used for good rather than evil, then a new order was needed, an order that would operate in the open, that would share knowledge rather than hoard it, that would actively oppose those who used magic for dark purposes. And so, In the urban city of Firsthold, Vanus Galerion began recruiting. He gathered magic users from all social classes across Somerset Isle. Nobles and commoners, Altmer and others, anyone with talent and discipline. His philosophy was revolutionary and terrifying to the established powers. He proposed to make magical items, potions, and spells available to anyone who could pay. Magic would no longer be limited to the aristocracy and the intellectuals. It would become a profession, a service, something woven into the fabric of everyday life. The rulers of Firsthold were horrified. Magic was dangerous. Magical experiments should be conducted only in unpopulated areas, not in the heart of a bustling city. The very idea of selling spells to common folk was madness. Galerion was brought before his former master, Aetherius, and King Rylus XII. He was made to state his intentions, to explain what he hoped to achieve with this fraternity he was forming. What he said in that chamber is lost to history. No one recorded his words. We can only imagine the arguments he must have made, the passion with which he spoke, the vision of a better future he painted for those who listened. Whatever he said, it worked. The charter was approved, and the Mages Guild was born. Chapter 2. Vanus Galerion. From Trectus to Archmagister. To understand the Mages Guild, you must first understand the man who founded it. Vanus Galerion was not born to greatness. He was born into servitude, into a world that denied him even the most basic human right, the ability to read. During the early bloody years of the Second Era, in the estate of Lord Guernas of Solitish-on-Ker, a child was born to common labourers. His parents named him Trectus. His parents worked the land, tended the animals, performed whatever tasks their lord demanded. It was a life of endless toil, of bowing to authority, of keeping one's head down and accepting one's place. But Trectus's father possessed something dangerous, something forbidden. He had taught himself to read. In secret, hidden from the eyes of Lord Guernas's guards, he had learned the shapes of letters, the meanings of words, the power that came from transforming symbols into understanding. And when his son was old enough, he passed this forbidden knowledge along, knowing full well the risks. Lord Guernas had been advised that literate servants were an abomination of nature, dangerous to themselves and their lords. He had closed all bookstalls in Solitich-on-Ker. Booksellers, poets, and teachers were forbidden except those within the Lord's own keep. But despite these prohibitions, a small smuggling operation kept books and scrolls in circulation, right under Guernas's nose. For years, it worked. Trectus learned to read. His father taught him in the quiet hours, in hidden moments stolen from their endless labor. And for a young boy who had nothing, these moments with words and stories must have felt like magic itself. Then, when Trectus was 8 years old, the smugglers were discovered and imprisoned. Some say Trectus's mother, a religious and fearful woman, betrayed them to save herself. Others whisper of different tragedies, different betrayals. The truth is lost to time. What we know is this. Shortly after the arrests, Trectus's father died. The circumstances are unclear, but a boy of 8 understands only that his father is gone, and the books with him, and the whole world has become impossibly dark. 3 months later, Trectus ran away. He made it as far as Alenor, halfway across Somerset Isle, before his small body gave out. A band of troubadours found him nearly dead, curled in a ditch by the side of the road. They nursed him back to health. They gave him work as an errand boy in exchange for food and shelter. For the first time in his life, Trectus was free, though freedom meant little more than survival. Among these troubadours was a soothsayer named Heliand, who had once trained as a mystic at Arteum. Heliand saw something in the boy, a spark, a potential that burned bright despite his circumstances. When the troupe performed in the village of Potenza on the far eastern end of Somerset, Heliand made a decision that would change the course of history. He took Trectus to the Isle of Arteum. The boy was 11 years old. He had survived slavery, betrayal, the loss of his father, and months of near starvation. When Aetherius, the magister of the isle, looked upon him, he saw past the ragged clothes and hollow cheeks. He saw what Heliand had seen, raw potential, burning bright and fierce. Aetherius accepted Trectus as a pupil. He gave him a new name, as was the Psijic tradition, Vanus Galerion. On Arteum, Vanus trained not just his mind, but his body. The Psijics believed in balance, in discipline, in the unity of physical and mental strength. He studied under the greatest magical minds of the age. He learned to harness magicka, to shape reality with will and word. He proved himself brilliant, diligent, and possessed of a rare quality, genuine compassion for others. It was on Arteum that Vanus Galerion met Manimarco. The two became friends, or something like friends, united by their exceptional talent. They studied together, practiced together, pushed each other to new heights of understanding. But where Galerion's heart remained light and warm, Manimarco's turned dark and cold. Where Galerion saw magic as a tool to help others, Manimarco saw only power to be claimed. And when Manimarco began his forbidden studies, when he started experimenting with necromancy and soul trapping, Galerion confronted him. The Psijic elders did nothing. They sent Manimarco away with barely a slap on the wrist. And in that moment, Vanus Galerion understood something fundamental. The Psijic Order, for all its wisdom and power, was broken. They had become set in their ways. They would not change. They could not change. For things to improve, for magic to serve rather than isolate, a new order had to be created. And so Galerion left Arteum. He returned to the cities of Somerset Isle, to the world of common people who needed magic but had no access to it. He began gathering followers, mages from every background and social class. In Firsthold, he established what would become the first Mages Guild Hall. The vision was simple but revolutionary: magic as a public service, spell merchants who would sell their knowledge openly, alchemists who would brew potions for any customer with coin, enchanters who would imbue items with power for anyone who requested it, training available to all who proved worthy, regardless of birth or status. From his childhood of want and injustice, Galerion had received his philosophy of sharing knowledge. From the Psijics of Arteum, he had received his training. And from these two sources, he built something entirely new: The Mages Guild grew like a tree from an acorn, spreading branches across Somerset Isle and gradually onto the mainland. Many rulers initially forbid it, fearing the power it represented, but their heirs, and their heirs' heirs, recognized the wisdom of allowing the guild to practice. Magic could not be suppressed forever. Better to regulate it, to channel it through an organization that answered to the empire, than to drive it underground where it could flourish unchecked. Galerion himself served as the first Archmagister, presiding over a council that would guide the guild's policies. He established the Order of the Lamp, a knightly organization dedicated to protecting guild members and their work. He created rules and hierarchies, but always with the goal of making magic accessible while keeping it safe. It should have been his greatest triumph, the culmination of everything he believed in. But Manimarco, his former friend, was building something in the shadows, something dark and terrible that would haunt Galerion for the rest of his life. Over time, as the guild grew and bureaucracy crept in, Galerion became disillusioned. The organization he had built to share knowledge freely had become, in his own bitter words, an intricate morass of political infighting. The idealism that had driven its creation was being suffocated by ambition, by petty rivalries, by mages more concerned with rank and status than with serving the people of Tamriel. He saw what the guild was becoming, and it broke his heart. This was not what he had envisioned. This was not what he had fought for. And when Manimarco resurfaced, leading an army of necromancers and undead horrors, Galerion knew what he had to do. He gathered an army of mages and lamp knights. He spoke to them of duty, of honor, of the eternal struggle against those who would pervert magic for evil ends. And he led them north to the cursed mountains where Manimarco waited. Before his last breath, he would face the tyranny of worms, and he would kill, at last, undeath itself. The battle was apocalyptic. Fire and frost and lightning tore across the mountainside. Necromancers summoned waves of undead, only to watch them shattered by the battle mage's searing streams of light. The earth itself trembled, the sky darkened, and in the heart of the chaos, two former friends met for the final time. Manimarco had become a lich. He had embraced undeath, had transformed himself into an abomination, had forsaken his humanity for immortality and power. When Galerion saw what his old companion had become, the full horror of it must have struck like a physical blow. This is what magic could do in the wrong hands. This is what knowledge without wisdom created. This is why the guild mattered, why it had to endure, why someone had to stand against the darkness. With a single touch, Galerion shook the mountain to its base. The undead horde crumbled, but the effort cost him everything. In that moment of triumph, as the artifacts of death were pulled from Manimarco's skeletal claw, Vanus Galerion died. The mage who had freed magic from the elite, who had given it to the common people, who had built an institution that would last for ages, fell in battle against his greatest enemy. Among the 1,000 good and evil who perished that day, history remembers him most of all. He who showed the way, he who gave everything, he who transformed the world, and then died trying to protect it from his own creation's shadow. The Mages Guild would continue without him. It would flourish and falter, triumph and fail, until finally collapsing centuries later. But the legacy of Vanus Galerion endured in every spell sold, in every potion brewed, in every young mage who found opportunity where once there had been only closed doors. From Trectus, the slave boy, to Vanus Galerion, the Archmagister, his story is the story of magic itself, powerful, transformative, and forever balanced between light and dark. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Mages Guild. In the year 230 of the Second Era, something unprecedented happened in Tamriel. For the first time in known history, magic became a profession rather than a mystery. The Mages Guild's founding was nothing short of revolutionary. Before Galerion, magic had been the domain of secretive orders like the Psijics, or court wizards who served specific noble houses, or hedge mages who wandered the roads selling dubious charms. There was no standardization, no regulation, no way for common folk to access magical services beyond hoping a traveling wizard would pass through their village. Galerion changed everything. After securing the charter from King Rilis XII and his former master Aetherius, the first guild hall opened in Firsthold. The building itself was modest by later standards, but its implications were staggering. Here, anyone could purchase potions, anyone could commission enchantments, anyone with talent could apply for training, regardless of their social standing or family connections. The reaction was immediate and divided. Common folk, who had long viewed magic with a mixture of awe and fear, suddenly had access to its benefits. A farmer could buy a potion to cure his child's illness. A merchant could have protective wards placed on her warehouse. A soldier could commission an enchanted weapon for a fraction of what a court wizard would charge. But the aristocracy and established magical orders viewed the guild with deep suspicion. To them, Galerion was dangerous, not because his magic was dark, but because he was giving power to people who had no right to it. The carefully maintained social hierarchies depended on magic remaining scarce, expensive, and available only to the elite. Despite this resistance, the guild spread. Like a tree from an acorn, as the old texts say, it grew branches across Somerset Isle and then gradually onto the mainland of Tamriel. Guild halls opened in every province, in nearly every city of any size. Each hall followed the same basic structure, offering the same core services, operating under the same charter and rules. The organizational structure was carefully designed. At the top stood the Archmage, headquartered in what would eventually become the Arcane University in the Imperial City. The Archmage presided over the Council of Mages, originally 6 Archmagisters who guided policy and handled disputes. Below them were the local guildmasters, who ran individual halls and managed their members. Each guild hall was both an academy and a workplace. New recruits started as associates, performing errands and menial tasks while learning basic spells. As they proved themselves, they advanced through ranks: apprentice, journeyman, evoker, conjurer, magician, warlock, wizard, and finally, master wizard. The highest achievers might join the council itself. The guild provided services that transformed daily life across Tamriel. Spell merchants sold knowledge of specific incantations. Alchemists brewed potions for every conceivable need, from healing injuries to increasing stamina to resisting magic. Enchanters could imbue weapons and armor with permanent magical properties. And for the truly desperate or ambitious, guild mages could be hired to handle specific problems, banishing malevolent spirits, locating lost items through divination, even serving as magical consultants for military campaigns. But magic, even regulated magic, required security. The Psijic Order never needed guards because their isle was protected by magic that could make it insubstantial, unreachable to any unwanted visitors. The Mages Guild, operating in the heart of cities, had no such protection. Rival mages might attack. Thieves might steal valuable artifacts. Angry mobs, stirred by fear of sorcery, might assault guild halls. Galerion's solution was the Order of the Lamp, a knightly organization dedicated to protecting the guild and its members. Lamp Knights followed their own local leader, called a Palatinus, who took orders directly from the Archmage. These warriors were given training in combating magical threats, access to certain guild services, and ranks that approximated their standing within the broader organization. The system wasn't perfect. Almost from the beginning, politics infected the guild's pure intentions. Ambitious mages schemed for advancement. Archmagisters played favorites. Local guild masters hoarded resources or pursued personal agendas. The bureaucracy grew more complex, more unwieldy, more concerned with maintaining its own power than with serving the public good. Vanus Galerion himself recognized these problems. Late in his life, he grew bitter about what the guild had become. The institution he had founded to share knowledge freely had become, in his words, an intricate morass of political infighting. The idealism was gone, replaced by careerism and infighting. But for all its flaws, the guild endured. It provided genuine value to the people of Tamriel. A young person with magical talent now had somewhere to go, somewhere to learn and grow. Villages that would never attract a court wizard could still benefit from magical services through guild outposts. Dangerous practitioners of dark magic could be countered by guild members acting in the public interest. The guild also established important precedents about the proper use of magic. From the beginning, there were rules. Certain practices were forbidden. Necromancy, in most circumstances. Destructive magic used against innocents. Enchantments placed without consent. Soul trapping of sentient beings without proper procedures. These rules weren't always followed, and enforcement was inconsistent. But they established a baseline of ethical magical practice that influenced Tamrielic society for centuries. Different provinces embraced the guild at different speeds and with varying enthusiasm. In High Rock, where magic had always been relatively common, guild halls flourished. In Cyrodiil, the guild became closely aligned with imperial authority, eventually receiving special status and privileges. In Morrowind, the guild struggled against the entrenched power of the Telvanni mage lords and the local great houses, who saw it as foreign interference. In Skyrim, the guild never fully took root, perhaps because the College of Winterhold had already filled that role for centuries. The Second Era saw the guild at its most idealistic, its most true to Galerion's original vision. Mages traveled the roads. offering services to those who needed them. Guild halls became centers of learning, where talented students could study without needing noble patronage. Research flourished as mages shared findings rather than guarding them jealously. But shadows were gathering. Even as the guild spread across Tamriel, another organization was forming in its wake, where the guild gathered in the light, conducting business openly and legally. This other order worked in darkness and secrecy. Mannimarco had not been idle during the guild's expansion. While Galerion built halls and recruited honest mages, the King of Worms was gathering necromancers, forming cells, spreading knowledge that the guild explicitly forbid. And he was building towards something terrible, something that would eventually force Galerion to abandon the very institution he had created. The Mages Guild was born from one man's vision of magic as a public good. It grew into an institution that touched every corner of Tamriel, that trained thousands of mages, that made magic accessible to anyone with discipline and coin. But from the moment of its founding, it carried within it the seeds of its own destruction, the political infighting that Galerion had warned about, the tendency toward bureaucracy over service, and most of all, the eternal presence of its dark mirror. For wherever there was light, Mannimarco ensured there would be shadow. Wherever the guild built, the worm cult waited, and that terrible symmetry would define magical practice in Tamriel for over 1,000 years. Chapter 4. The Shadow Rises. Mannimarco and the King of Worms. While Vanus Galerion was building his Guild of Light, Mannimarco was crafting an empire of darkness. The story of Mannimarco is one of brilliance corrupted, of genius turned toward ends that make the blood run cold. Some texts claim he was of royal blood, though which royal line remains uncertain. Even more remarkably, Mannimarco himself appears in the historical record "Where Were You When the Dragon Broke?", claiming to have been present during the Middle Dawn, that impossible period between the 13th and 23rd centuries of the First Era when time itself fractured. If this account is true, it would make him impossibly ancient, far older than any normal Altmer could be. Mannimarco identifies himself not as an Altmer, but as one of the Altmer, the original undiluted elven race from the Merethic era, suggesting origins that predate recorded history. Whether these claims represent literal truth, the distortions of a dragon break, or the boasts of a prideful necromancer remains a matter of scholarly debate. What we know for certain is that Mannimarco arrived on Artium as a young man, joining the Psijic Order at roughly the same time as Vanus Galerion. He was brilliant, perhaps even more naturally gifted than his contemporary. Where Galerion had to work for his mastery, magic seemed to flow through Mannimarco like water, natural and effortless. The two became close, drawn together by their exceptional abilities. They studied under the same masters. They practiced the same spells. They debated philosophy and magic theory deep into the night. One with a heart described as light and warm, the other with a heart dark and cold, two sides of the same coin, balanced on the edge of a blade. But Mannimarco's studies took him down paths that horrified his companion. He became fascinated by necromancy, by the fundamental question of death and what lay beyond. To Mannimarco, death was not sacred. It was not something to be respected or feared. It was simply another aspect of existence to be understood, mastered, and eventually conquered. He began with theory, ancient texts on the nature of the soul, forbidden manuscripts describing how the dragon priests of old had enthralled their Drauga servants, Ayleid tablets detailing methods of summoning spirits from beyond the veil, and most dangerous of all, the Crimson Book of Skulls, which the legendary Shalador had supposedly destroyed centuries earlier. Mannimarco found it, or perhaps it found him. The book taught secrets that should have remained buried: how to trap souls in gems, how to bind the dead to service, how to use necromancy not merely to animate corpses, but to enslave the very essence of those who had passed on. Theory became practice. Beneath Sapora Tower, on Artaeum, in spaces the Psijics rarely visited, Mannimarco began his experiments. He summoned spirits, he captured souls, he learned to make the dead dance to his commands like puppets, their free will stripped away, their eternal rest denied. When Galerion discovered what his friend was doing, the confrontation was explosive. The two mages faced each other in those ancient halls, their voices echoing off stone that had stood for millennia. "Your wicked mysticism is no way to wield your power," Galerion declared. "You bring horror to the spirit world. Your studies must cease." Mannimarco's response was dismissive, almost contemptuous. He scoffed at notions of morality and magic. Power itself, he argued, had no intrinsic alignment. It was neither good nor evil. Magic was simply a tool, and those who refused to explore its full potential were weak, limited by arbitrary ethical constraints that had no basis in reality. Galerion took his concerns to the Psijic elders. Surely they would see the danger. Surely they would act. Mannimarco was violating the natural order, enslaving souls, practicing arts that could unleash untold horrors upon the world. But the elders were dismissive. "Speak no more of him," they commanded. Their solution was to send Mannimarco to the mainland on an errand, believing that removing him from Artaeum would solve the problem. It was the worst possible decision. On the mainland, free from oversight, Mannimarco truly began his work. He sought out the most forbidden knowledge. He made contact with Daedric princes, particularly Molag Bal, the father of vampires and lord of domination. Some sources suggest he even traveled to Cold Harbor itself, retrieving the first black soul gems from that nightmare realm. These gems, unlike ordinary soul gems, could trap the souls of sentient beings, a violation of both natural law and the teachings of the divine Arcane. Mannimarco began recruiting. He found mages who had been rejected by legitimate orders, who harbored resentments against the established magical hierarchy. He gathered witches practicing in isolation, reachmen who had never been welcomed in civilized society, necromancers who had been persecuted for their studies. To each, he promised power beyond measure for those who served loyally. He dubbed his new organization the Order of the Black Worm, known more commonly as the Worm Cult. The name was a mockery of the monastic orders dedicated to the divines, a deliberate inversion of everything they represented. Where the temples celebrated life and light, the Worm Cult embraced death and darkness. The structure of the cult mirrored and perverted the Mages Guild. At the top was Mannimarco himself, the King of Worms, the supreme authority whose word was absolute. Below him were the worm anchorites, leaders of individual cells called worm nests. These anchorites reported directly to Manimarco through means that remained mysterious, some form of necromantic communication that transcended normal distances. Below them were ranks of necromancer adepts, worm warriors who provided physical protection, and worm thralls who performed menial tasks. New members were attracted by promises of power and knowledge forbidden by the guild. They were sworn to absolute secrecy on pain of undeath, a threat that was not metaphorical. Those who betrayed the cult found themselves transformed into mindless, undead servants, their souls enslaved for eternity. In most parts of Tamriel, necromancy was considered an atrocity, a violation of the natural order and the dignity of the dead. But Manimarco was a master diplomat as well as a master necromancer. He persuaded, bribed, or intimidated authorities in various jurisdictions to turn a blind eye to his cult's activities. Most remarkably, in Cyrodiil during the Second Era, he convinced the ruling Tharn family to declare necromancy a legal, magical practice. The Order of the Black Worm actually replaced the Mages Guild as the officially sanctioned magical advisors to the imperial throne. This was Manimarco's genius. He understood that power flowed not just from magical might, but from political influence. By legitimizing his practices, by gaining the protection of powerful families and governments, he made his cult nearly untouchable. Guild members who opposed him could be arrested for interfering with legal magical activities, and all the while, his necromancers grew in number and strength. But Manimarco wanted more than political power. He wanted to become something beyond mortal, beyond even the limits of elven longevity. He wanted godhood itself. Through decades of study and experimentation, accumulating artifacts and forbidden knowledge, Manimarco transformed himself into a lich. The process required terrible sacrifices, the corruption of his own body and soul through dark rituals. His flesh became something other than alive, preserved through necromantic magic. His heart ceased to beat, yet he endured. His blood became a poisonous acid coursing through dead veins. As a lich, Manimarco was functionally immortal. He could be destroyed, but even destruction might not be permanent. His phylactery, whatever form it took, could allow him to return. And with immortality came patience, the ability to plan across centuries rather than mere years. During the Alliance War of the Second Era, Manimarco became entangled in the conspiracy of the Five Companions. He joined Varan Aquilarios, Abnur Tharn, Lyris Titanborn, and Sai Sahan in their quest to obtain the Amulet of Kings and legitimize Varan's claim to the Ruby Throne. But Manimarco had no interest in helping Varan become emperor. He was serving a greater master, Molag Bal himself. The ritual in the Chamber of the Dragonfires was a deception. Manimarco tricked his companions into using the amulet to trigger the Soul Burst, a catastrophic event that shattered the barriers between Nirn and Oblivion. This allowed Molag Bal to initiate the Planar Meld, an attempt to drag all of Nirn into his realm of Cold Harbor. For his service, Manimarco expected to be rewarded with even greater power. But he misunderstood Bal's nature. The Lord of Domination was not the type to share power or honor debts. When the vestige defeated Manimarco and his spirit attempted to ascend to godhood, Bal intervened, dragging the King of Worms down to Cold Harbor for eternal torture. Yet even this was not the end. Manimarco eventually escaped, returning to Tamriel to continue his work. And according to some sources, he succeeded in his ultimate goal. During the events known as the Warp in the West in 3E417, Manimarco achieved a form of divine status. He became the Revenant, the Necromancer's moon, a celestial body that orbits Neon and grants special power to necromancers when visible in the sky. This created a strange duality. There was Manimarco the god, existing as a celestial phenomenon, and there was Manimarco the Lich, still active on Neon, still leading his cult, still pursuing his dark arts. How this was possible, how one being could exist in two forms simultaneously, remains one of the great mysteries of Tamrielic metaphysics. What is certain is that Manimarco's influence never truly ended. Even when individual worm cult members were hunted down, even when their schemes were foiled, the organization endured. New necromancers always emerged to take the place of those who fell. The knowledge Manimarco had spread could not be unlearned. The cult he had founded could not be fully destroyed. His rivalry with the Mages Guild defined magical practice across multiple eras. Every necromancer who practiced in secret was, in some sense, his spiritual descendant. Every soul gem that trapped a human spirit carried his taint. And every time the guild tried to regulate or ban necromancy, they were fighting against the legacy of the King of Worms. In the Third Era, during the Oblivion Crisis, Manimarco made his final major play against the Mages Guild. Archmage Hannibal Traven had instituted a strict ban on necromancy within the guild, causing many members to leave in protest. These disaffected mages flocked to Manimarco's banner. The King of Worms launched a coordinated assault on guild halls across Cyrodiil, stealing artifacts, killing members, and gathering souls for his rituals. The conflict culminated when the hero of Kvatch tracked Manimarco to Echo Cave. There, in a final confrontation, the mortal incarnation of the King of Worms was destroyed. His staff of worms, his robes, his artifacts, all fell into the hands of the Mages Guild. But as any necromancer knows, death is not always the end. The celestial Manimarco still orbits Neon, granting power to those who know how to harness it. And who can say whether the mortal Manimarco was truly destroyed or merely forced into another lengthy period of recovery and planning? The story of Manimarco is ultimately a tragedy, though not one that invites much sympathy. Here was a mind of tremendous potential, capable of mastering any magical discipline, of achieving genuine greatness. In another world, with different choices, he might have been remembered alongside Vanus Galerion as a revolutionary who changed magic forever. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about what happens when brilliance is married to cruelty, when the pursuit of power overrides all other considerations. He chose undeath over life, domination over cooperation, eternal existence over meaningful connection. And in doing so, he became the very thing Galerion had feared most. Proof that magic, in the wrong hands, could transform a person into something monstrous. Manimarco, the king of worms, the first of the leeches, the necromancer's moon. His name is whispered in fear by those who respect the dead, and in certain dark places, by certain dark practitioners, his name is whispered with reverence, as they seek to follow in his footsteps toward immortality at any cost. The worms still writhe in the darkness, patient and hungry, and somewhere, in some form, the king who commands them watches and waits. Chapter 5. The Worm Cult. Death's Dark Fellowship. The Order of the Black Worm stands as the perfect shadow to the Mages Guild's light. Where the guild sought to democratize magic and make it serve the common good, the Worm Cult pursued power through the most forbidden practices, enslaving the dead and trafficking in souls. Understanding the Worm Cult requires understanding necromancy itself and why it has been feared and forbidden throughout Tamrielic history. Necromancy is not simply the animation of corpses, though that is part of it. At its core, necromancy is the manipulation of life force and the boundary between life and death. It involves communion with the dead, the trapping of souls, the binding of spirits to service against their will. It is magic that fundamentally violates the natural order established by Arcane, the divine associated with death and the afterlife. The priests of Arcane teach that death is sacred, a transition that should not be disturbed. When a person dies, their soul is meant to travel to Aetherius, or to whatever afterlife their deity or nature determines. To trap that soul, to bind it, to force it back into its rotting corpse, or imprison it in a gem. These acts are considered among the greatest sins possible. But to Manimarco and his followers, such moral considerations were irrelevant. Power was power, magic was magic, and necromancy offered abilities that other schools of magic could not match. The worm cult structure was designed to operate in shadows while maintaining absolute loyalty to its leader. Each cell, called a worm nest, functioned semi-independently, led by a worm anchorite who somehow communicated directly with Manimarco despite vast distances. The means of this communication remain mysterious. Some suggest necromantic bonds that transcended normal space. Others point to artifacts or rituals that allowed the King of Worms to speak through his servants. Below the anchorites were various ranks of necromancers, warriors, and thralls. New recruits were attracted by promises of power and knowledge that the legitimate magical orders refused to teach. They were required to sever all ties to their former lives. Family, friends, previous loyalties, all had to be abandoned. Distractions the cult taught interfered with the single-minded pursuit of necromantic mastery. Members were marked with black pentagrams, either tattooed on their flesh or emblazoned on their robes. This mark symbolized the damnation of their souls, their willing embrace of practices that would bar them from normal afterlives. In some sense, joining the worm cult was a permanent decision, one that could not be undone, even in death. Former members who tried to leave were hunted down and transformed into mindless, undead servants, their souls enslaved as a warning to others. The cult's activities varied, depending on their goals and the demands of their leader. Sometimes they gathered artifacts of dark power, seeking out cursed items and necromantic implements. Sometimes they performed rituals to strengthen barriers between Nirn and Oblivion, or weaken them, depending on Mannimarco's current schemes. Always, they pursued knowledge of death magic, experimenting with new spells and techniques. One of their most significant accomplishments was the perfection of black soul gems. Unlike ordinary soul gems, which could only capture the souls of animals and lesser creatures, black soul gems could trap human, elven, and other sentient souls. These gems were created through rituals performed during specific celestial alignments, particularly when the necromancer's moon was visible. The applications of black soul gems were numerous and terrifying. They could be used to power enchantments of exceptional strength. They could fuel rituals that required vast amounts of soul energy. They could even serve as phylacteries for liches, vessels that would allow a necromancer to return from death. The ability to trap sentient souls represented a fundamental violation of Arcane's laws, and the priests of that divine made hunting down black soul gems and their creators a priority. During the Second Era, the Worm Cult became deeply entangled in the Alliance War and the Plenimeld. Mannimarco had allied with Molag Bal, offering his cult services to the Daedric Prince in exchange for power and knowledge. Worm Cult members served as agents of the Plenimeld, working to anchor Cold Harbor to Nirn at various points across Tamriel. They operated throughout the provinces, establishing bases in ruins and hidden locations. In Cyrodiil, they had official sanction from the Tharn family, operating openly in some areas. In other provinces, they worked in secret, hiding in ancient Ayleid ruins, Nordic barrows, or natural caverns that could serve as headquarters for their activities. The cult clashed repeatedly with the Mages Guild during this period. While the guild was legally prohibited from taking direct action against the cult in areas where necromancy was legal, guild members still worked to oppose them wherever possible. Adventurers were hired to clear out worm nests. Artifacts were recovered before the cult could claim them. Rituals were disrupted, and anchorites were eliminated when opportunities arose. One particularly ambitious worm cult scheme involved attempting to resurrect ancient Ayleid kings and dragon priests, adding their power to Mannimarco's forces. They performed rituals at dragon shrines across Skyrim, attempting to bind companion spirits from the ancient Nord tradition. They even sought alliances with other dark factions, including the Reachmen and, according to rumors, the Slode of Thras. The relationship between the Worm Cult and the Five Companions was complex. Mannimarco had infiltrated the group with the explicit purpose of causing the soul burst, but the other companions were not all innocent. Abnur Tharn knew of Mannimarco's nature and may have been complicit in some of his plans. Regardless, when the soul burst occurred, it unleashed chaos across Tamriel, and the Worm Cult was positioned to exploit that chaos fully. Throughout the Plenimeld, the cult worked tirelessly to strengthen Molag Bal's hold on Nirn. They captured souls by the thousands, feeding them to the dark anchors that tethered Cold Harbor to Nirn. They raised armies of undead to support the Daedric invasions. They performed rituals that weakened the barriers between worlds. For a time, It seemed the cult might achieve ultimate victory, helping to drag all of Nirn into its eternal slavery under the Lord of Domination. But the vestige, aided by the reformed companions and forces from all three alliances, fought back. Worm cult operations were disrupted, their bases were destroyed, their rituals were interrupted, and ultimately, in the heart of Cold Harbor itself, Manimarco was defeated and dragged down by his own master for attempting to seize power for himself. You might think this would be the end of the Order of the Black Worm, but necromancers are, by definition, difficult to kill permanently. The cult survived Manimarco's defeat, lying low for a time but never truly disbanded. Cells continued operating in secret. New anchorites emerged to replace those who had fallen. The knowledge Manimarco had spread could not be unlearned. In the Third Era, particularly during the Oblivion Crisis, the worm cult resurfaced with devastating effect. When Archmage Hannibal Traven instituted his ban on necromancy within the Mages Guild, many disaffected mages left the guild and joined the cult instead. This influx of trained practitioners, combined with Manimarco's return to active leadership, allowed the cult to launch a coordinated assault on Mages Guild halls across Cyrodiil. The attacks were brutal and effective. Guild members were killed or had their souls enslaved. Artifacts were stolen. In some cases, entire guild halls were destroyed. The cult placed spies within the guild's own ranks, members who had been secretly serving Manimarco for years. These traitors sabotaged operations from within, providing intelligence that made the cult's attacks devastatingly accurate. The guild's response was hampered by internal politics and the loss of key personnel. Traven himself was forced to sacrifice his own life in a desperate bid to gain information about the cult's plans. Only when the hero of Kvatch took up the fight did the tide turn. By hunting down cult operations, recovering stolen artifacts, and ultimately confronting Manimarco himself in Echo Cave, the hero dealt the cult a blow from which it never truly recovered. After the death of Manimarco's mortal form in 3E 403, the Order of the Black Worm fractured. Some cells continued operating independently, others disbanded entirely. By the Fourth Era, when the Mages Guild itself dissolved, the cult had largely faded from prominence. Necromancers still practiced their dark arts, but they did so as individuals or small groups, rather than as part of Manimarco's grand organization. However, recent events suggest the cult may be experiencing a resurgence. In the modern era, depicted in Elder Scrolls Online, a new leader calling himself Wormblood has emerged on the island of Solstice, attempting to rebuild the Order and complete Manimarco's work. This new chapter of the cult's history operates differently than before, infiltrating factions and manipulating events from the shadows, rather than relying on open displays of necromantic might. The worm cult stands as a testament to the dangers of unregulated magical practice and the seductive nature of forbidden knowledge. Every member who joined did so willingly, drawn by promises of power and the thrill of pursuing magic that society deemed taboo. They sacrificed their morality, their connections to the living world, and ultimately their souls, for the chance to master death itself. And in a way, they succeeded. The cult may have been repeatedly defeated, its leader destroyed or imprisoned multiple times. But the knowledge it spread continues to influence necromantic practice across Tamriel. Every necromancer working in isolation carries a fragment of Manimarco's teachings. Every black soul gem created uses techniques the cult perfected. Every undead thrall raised echoes the rituals they developed. The Order of the Black Worm is more than just a cult. It is an idea, a philosophy that death is not an ending, but a tool, that morality is irrelevant in the pursuit of power, that the boundaries between life and death exist only to be transgressed. As long as that idea persists, as long as there are mages willing to embrace the forbidden and damn themselves for power, something like the worm cult will always exist. In the shadows beneath ruins, in hidden caves far from civilization, in the minds of those who whisper black prayers to the necromancer's moon, the worms still writhe and hunger. And they are patient, so very patient, for death itself is patient. The tyranny of worms may have been challenged, may have been temporarily defeated, but it was never truly ended. And Vanus Galerion, who died to oppose it, understood this better than anyone. The fight against the darkness is eternal, and every victory is temporary. Somewhere, in some form, the King of Worms watches, and the shadows grow long. Once more. Chapter 6. The Guild Across the Eras. Second Era Glory. The Second Era was the Mages Guild's golden age, the period when Galerion's vision was most fully realized. From its founding in 2E 230 to the chaos of the Planemeld in 2E 582, the Guild spread across every province of Tamriel, established standardized magical education, and became an institution as familiar as the temples or the army. This was the era when magic became truly accessible, when a farmer's child with talent could realistically aspire to become a court wizard or a guild instructor. The barriers that had kept magical knowledge locked away were not completely eliminated, but they were lowered dramatically. In Somerset Isle, where the guild was founded, guild halls flourished despite initial resistance from the Altmeri establishment. The High Elves had always viewed themselves as the supreme practitioners of magic, and many saw the guild as a vulgar commercialization of what should remain an art. But the practical benefits were undeniable. Even those who disdained the guild's philosophy still made use of its services when convenient. The mainland provinces embraced the guild with varying degrees of enthusiasm. In Cyrodiil, the guild became closely aligned with imperial authority. The Arcane University in the imperial city served as the guild's headquarters and the seat of the Archmage. This location symbolized the guild's importance to the empire and provided it with both prestige and protection. High Rock saw multiple major guild halls, particularly in the Iliac Bay region. The Bretons, with their mixed human and elven heritage, had always had a strong affinity for magic. Guild halls in Daggerfall, Wayrest, Sentinel, and other major cities became centers of learning and commerce. The guild fit naturally into High Rock's feudal society, where mages had traditionally served noble houses. Now those services could be purchased by anyone with sufficient coin. In Hammerfell, the guild faced more resistance, particularly in the crown-supporting regions. Traditional Redguard culture viewed magic with suspicion, a legacy of their ancient conflicts with the sinistral elves, the left-handed elves who had once enslaved their ancestors in Yokuda. The Redguards prized physical skill, swordsmanship, and martial prowess above magical ability. To them, relying on spells was almost cowardly, a substitute for true skill. But even in Hammerfell, the guild found its place. The forebears, Redguards, who had adopted more cosmopolitan attitudes, were more accepting of magical practice. And regardless of cultural attitudes, the practical benefits of healing potions, enchanted weapons, and protective wards could not be denied. Guild halls in Sentinel and other major cities operated successfully, though they never achieved the prominence they held in other provinces. Valenwood presented unique challenges. The Bosmer lived in cities grown from living trees, in harmony with the Green Pact that forbade them from harming plant life. Traditional construction was forbidden, which meant guild halls had to be built from imported materials or grown through magical means. The nomadic nature of some Bosmer tribes made establishing permanent guild presence difficult, and the Bosmer's own magical traditions, particularly their communion with nature and their ability to shapeshift, sometimes conflicted with the structured, academic approach the guild favored. Despite these obstacles, guild halls were established in Eldenroot and other major cities. The guild adapted to local customs, employing Bosmer mages who understood their own culture's relationship with magic, and the demand for magical services, particularly enchantments and alchemy, ensured the guild's continued presence. Elsewhere's desert landscape and the Khajiit's unique culture created another set of challenges. The Khajiit had their own magical traditions, including the mysterious moon singers and the main spiritual authority. Skooma trafficking and the general lawlessness in parts of Elsewhere made guild operations dangerous. Yet guild halls operated in Rimmen and other population centers, serving both locals and the many travelers who passed through the region's trade routes. Black Marsh was perhaps the most hostile environment for the guild. The Argonian homeland was virtually impenetrable to outsiders, its swamps and diseases claiming the lives of most who attempted to venture deep into the interior. The Argonians had their own relationship with magic, particularly through the Hist trees and their mysterious connection to the sentient vegetation that guided their culture. Traditional guild magic meant little in a place where shamanic traditions and Hist communion dominated. The few guild outposts in Black Marsh were confined to the border regions and port cities, serving mainly non-Argonian populations. The guild never truly penetrated Argonian culture, and perhaps wisely, they didn't force the issue. Morrowind was a special case, one that would cause the guild endless frustration. The Dunmer had their own ancient magical traditions, particularly the Great House Telvanni, whose wizard lords were among the most powerful mages in all of Tamriel. These Telvanni lived in massive mushroom towers grown through magic, and they viewed the Mages Guild with open contempt. Why should they join an organization run by outlanders following rules made by foreigners when they had practiced magic for thousands of years? The guild established halls in Vivek City, Balmora, Aldrun, Caldera, and Sadrith Mora, but they always struggled against local resistance. The Telvanni wouldn't join. the temple viewed them with suspicion. The other great houses tolerated them, but offered little support. Only in imperial-controlled areas did the guild operate with anything approaching comfort, and even there they were reminded daily that they were outsiders in a land with its own ways. Despite these provincial variations, the guild maintained certain core principles across all its operations. Training was standardized. A spell learned in First Hold would work the same in Riften. An enchantment purchased in Daggerfall used the same techniques as one commissioned in Mournhold. This standardization was one of the guild's greatest achievements, creating a common magical language that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. The guild's services touched every aspect of Tamrielic life during the Second Era. Merchants commissioned protective wards for their warehouses. Nobles hired guild mages as tutors for their magically gifted children. Adventurers purchased potions and scrolls before embarking on dangerous quests. Even the military made use of guild services, employing battle mages during conflicts and commissioning enchanted equipment for officers. Research flourished within the guild halls. Mages shared their findings rather than guarding them jealously as the Psijics or Telvanni did. New spells were developed and refined. Alchemical techniques improved. Enchanting methods became more efficient. The collective advancement of magical knowledge accelerated dramatically compared to earlier eras when each practitioner worked in isolation. The guild also served an important regulatory function. When a rogue mage terrorized a community, guild members could be called upon to deal with the threat. When magical disasters occurred, such as a summoning gone wrong, or an enchantment that had grown unstable, the guild provided expertise to resolve the situation. They investigated reports of dangerous artifacts and secured them in guild vaults. They mediated disputes between mages and provided arbitration when magical contracts were broken. During the Alliance War of the Second Era, the guild attempted to remain neutral, though this neutrality was constantly tested. All three alliances sought to recruit guild members for their war efforts. Individual mages often did join military campaigns, but the guild as an institution tried to avoid taking sides. This neutrality was imperfect and controversial, but it allowed guild halls in all three alliance territories to continue operating throughout the conflict. The Planemeld crisis tested the guild like nothing before. When Molag Bal's dark anchors began falling across Tamriel, when the barriers between Nirn and Oblivion weakened, the guild found itself on the front lines of the defense. Guild mages studied the anchors, seeking ways to destroy or weaken them. They fought alongside adventurers to close dolmens and disrupt Daedric rituals. They provided magical support to the Alliance armies that ultimately invaded Cold Harbor itself. This crisis also brought the guild into direct conflict with the Worm Cult. Mannimarco's necromancers were actively supporting the Planemeld, and the guild couldn't remain neutral in the face of such a threat. Guild members hunted Worm Cult operations, recovered artifacts the cult sought, and worked to counter their dark rituals. Many guild mages died in this conflict, sacrificing themselves to protect Tamriel from Daedric invasion. The guild emerged from the Planemeld crisis with its reputation enhanced. They had proven their value not just as merchants of magic, but as defenders of Nirn itself. Membership swelled, New guild halls opened. The guild's influence reached its peak. But shadows were gathering, even at the height of this golden age. The political infighting that Galerion had warned about was growing worse. Ambitious mages schemed for advancement, caring more about personal power than the guild's mission. Corruption crept in as some guild members abused their positions for personal gain. The bureaucracy became more complex and less responsive to actual needs. And always, the question of necromancy loomed. In some jurisdictions, it was legal. In others, forbidden. The guild's policy was inconsistent, varying by province and even by individual guild hall. This inconsistency created resentment on all sides. Necromancers felt persecuted. Those who opposed necromancy felt the guild wasn't doing enough to combat it. The issue would only grow more contentious in the centuries to come. The Second Era also saw the beginning of the guild's complicated relationship with the Empire. As the guild became more established, more prosperous, it also became more politically important. Emperors sought to control or influence it. The guild sought imperial protection and favorable laws. This dance of mutual advantage and competing interests would define the guild's operations through the Third Era and ultimately contribute to its downfall. Despite these growing problems, the Second Era remained the guild's finest hour. The vision Vanus Galerion had fought for was alive and flourishing. Magic served the people. Knowledge was shared. Young mages from all backgrounds could find training and opportunity. The guild halls, with their distinctive architecture and welcoming atmosphere, became landmarks in every major city, symbols of enlightenment and progress. In the quiet moments, in the libraries where apprentices studied ancient tomes, in the practice halls where students learned to shape magicka, in the alchemical workshops where potions bubbled and brewed, you could feel it, the sense that magic was no longer a mystery hoarded by the elite, but a craft that belonged to anyone willing to learn. This was what Galerion had dreamed of, and for a few centuries, before politics and pride and the darkness of the Oblivion Crisis tore it all apart, the dream was real. Chapter 7. The Guild in the Third Era. Power and Politics. The Third Era brought both triumph and decay to the Mages Guild. The organization had survived the tumult of the Second Era, had weathered the Planemeld crisis, and entered this new age as an established institution. But with establishment came complacency. With power came corruption. And with success came the inevitable political infighting that would eventually tear the guild apart. The early Third Era saw the guild consolidate its position across Tamriel. The Arcane University in the Imperial City had become not just the headquarters of the guild, but one of the most important magical research institutions on Nirn. Its libraries contained thousands of volumes on magical theory and practice. Its laboratories hosted experiments that pushed the boundaries of what magic could accomplish. Its faculty included some of the greatest minds of the age. Access to the Arcane University was highly restricted. Only guild members who had achieved the rank of wizard or higher could gain entry to its inner chambers. This exclusivity made admission a prestigious achievement, something ambitious mages worked years to attain. The Archmage's office was located here, in a tower overlooking the Imperial City, a fitting symbol of the guild's authority and influence. But this concentration of power and prestige also created problems. The Arcane University became insular, concerned more with abstract research and internal politics than with serving the public good. The gap between the university's elite and the common guild members working in provincial halls widened. Resentment festered. In the provinces, guild halls continued operating much as they had in the Second Era, but cracks were showing in the foundation. Competition between individual halls for resources and prestige led to infighting. Guildmasters who should have been cooperating were instead undermining each other. The Council of Mages, which was supposed to provide guidance and mediate disputes, became a political battlefield where personal rivalries overshadowed the guild's mission. Individual provinces had their own unique challenges. In Morrowind, the guild continued its uneasy coexistence with the Telvanni and other native magical traditions. The situation came to a head when the guild attempted to monopolize trade in Dwemer artifacts, bringing them into direct conflict with House Hlalu and local custom. This overreach demonstrated how the guild had grown arrogant, attempting to use its imperial backing to override local laws and traditions. In Skyrim, the guild's relationship with the College of Winterhold remained complicated. The college had existed long before the Mages Guild and maintained its independence throughout the guild's rise. While there was cooperation between the two institutions, there was also rivalry. The college trained some of the finest mages in Tamriel, but its isolation and focus on pure research made it seem aloof. The Mages Guild, with its commercial approach and political connections, represented everything the college disdained. The quality of guild services became inconsistent during this era. Some guild halls maintained high standards, employing talented mages and providing excellent training and services. Others became little more than shops, places where anyone with coin could purchase pre-made potions and standard enchantments with no regard for quality or safety. The guild's reputation suffered as horror stories spread. Potions that made people sick, enchantments that failed at critical moments, novice mages given responsibilities beyond their abilities. The question of necromancy, which had simmered throughout the Second Era, finally boiled over in the late Third Era. The practice remained legal in some provinces and forbidden in others, creating jurisdictional nightmares. Necromancers argued that their practice was a legitimate school of magic, no different from conjuration or restoration. They pointed out that the Dunmer practiced it openly, that it had practical applications, and that banning it was arbitrary censorship. Opponents countered that necromancy violated the sanctity of death, enslaved souls against their will, and represented magic at its most corrupt and dangerous. The priests of Arcane waged a continuous campaign against necromantic practice, and many guild members supported them. But as long as necromancy remained legal in some areas, the guild couldn't completely prohibit it without contradicting its own charter about making all magic available. This inconsistency allowed necromancers to operate in a grey area. They could claim guild membership in jurisdictions where their practice was legal, gaining access to guild resources and protection. When challenged in areas where necromancy was forbidden, they could simply move or practice in secret. The worm cult exploited these loopholes ruthlessly, with some of its members operating openly as legitimate necromancers while serving Manimarco in secret. Political corruption also infiltrated the guild during the Third Era. Wealthy patrons could buy influence, ensuring their favored candidates rose through the ranks regardless of merit. Noble families placed their less talented children in guild positions as sinecures, guild halls where they could hold impressive titles while doing little actual work. Some guildmasters accepted bribes to overlook illegal magical practices or provide services that should have been forbidden. The Oblivion Crisis of 3E 433 caught the guild unprepared and divided. When Mehrunes Dagon's invasion began, when Oblivion gates opened across Tamriel and Daedra poured through to terrorize the population, the guild should have been at the forefront of the defense, and many individual guild members were heroic, fighting alongside soldiers and adventurers to close gates and protect communities. But the guild as an institution failed to mount a coordinated response. The Archmage, Hannibal Traven, was preoccupied with internal matters, particularly his growing conflict with necromancers within the guild. The Council of Mages was paralyzed by infighting. Communication between guild halls broke down. Some halls were destroyed by Daedric attacks with little support from their sister institutions. It was during this crisis that Hannibal Traven made his controversial decision. He instituted a complete ban on necromancy within the Mages Guild. No more grey areas, no more jurisdictional exceptions. Any guild member who practiced necromancy would be immediately expelled, regardless of local laws. The rationale was sound. The Oblivion Crisis was being supported by necromancers, particularly the worm cult. Daedric cults were using necromantic rituals to strengthen their gates and summon more powerful demons. The guild had to take a clear stance against these practices if it was to maintain any credibility as a force for good. But the execution was disastrous. Hundreds of guild members were expelled overnight, many of them talented mages who had served loyally for years. They hadn't been practicing dark rituals or serving Daedric princes. They had simply been studying or practicing necromancy in jurisdictions where it was legal. From their perspective, they had done nothing wrong, yet they were cast out without warning or appeal. These disaffected mages had nowhere to go except to Manimarco. The King of Worms welcomed them with open arms, adding skilled practitioners to his Order of the Black Worm. What should have weakened the cult instead strengthened it dramatically. And these new recruits, bitter about their treatment, provided the cult with intelligence about guild operations, security measures, and internal politics. Manimarco launched a coordinated assault on guild halls across Cyrodiil. The attacks were surgical, targeting specific halls, specific individuals, stealing particular artifacts that the cult needed for its rituals. Guild members were killed or had their souls trapped in black soul gems. In some cases, spies within the guild itself facilitated the attacks, opening doors and disabling wards. The guild was reeling. Traven's ban on necromancy, instead of strengthening the organization, had brought it to the brink of collapse. The Archmage himself was forced to make terrible sacrifices, ultimately giving his own life in a desperate attempt to gain information about Mannimarco's plans. Into this crisis stepped the hero of Kvatch, a prisoner who would become the champion of Cyrodiil and ultimately save not just the guild, but all of Tamriel. Through a series of dangerous quests, the hero recovered stolen artifacts, hunted down cult operations, and exposed traitors within the guild's own ranks. The hero uncovered the cult's plan to use the Bloodworm Helm and the Necromancer's Amulet to perform a terrible ritual that would grant Mannimarco unprecedented power. The final confrontation took place in Echo Cave, where Mannimarco was attempting to conduct his greatest ritual. There, in a battle that combined physical combat with devastating magical exchanges, the hero of Kvatch destroyed the mortal form of the King of Worms. Mannimarco's staff, his robes, his artifacts, all fell to the hero, and through that champion, to the Mages Guild. The hero was proclaimed the new Archmage, a fitting reward for saving the guild from destruction. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The guild had been grievously wounded. Dozens of halls had been damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of members had died or been expelled. The organization's reputation had been shattered by its inability to protect its own members or mount an effective defense. And looming over everything was the larger Oblivion crisis. Martin Septim sacrificed himself to banish Mehrunes Dagon and end the invasion. But the empire was left without an emperor, without a clear succession, plunged into uncertainty and chaos. The guild, which had relied heavily on imperial support and authority, found itself adrift in a world that was fundamentally changed. The Third Era ended not with the guild at its peak, but broken and vulnerable, having survived only through the intervention of a single exceptional individual. The Golden Age was over. The dream that Vanus Galerion had built was crumbling. And in the political chaos that would follow, the guild would face its greatest challenge, whether it could continue to exist at all. Looking back, we can see the seeds of the guild's destruction were planted throughout the Third Era. The political infighting, the corruption, the disconnection between the elite at the Arcane University and common members in provincial halls, the inconsistent policies on necromancy that created resentment on all sides, the reliance on imperial authority that made the guild vulnerable when that authority collapsed. But we can also see moments of genuine heroism and purpose, individual guild members who lived up to Galerion's ideals, who used their magic to help others, who fought against darkness when it would have been easier to look away. The researchers who advanced magical knowledge, the teachers who trained the next generation, the healers and enchanters and alchemists who served their communities with skill and dedication. The Third Era Mages Guild was a study in contradictions, powerful yet vulnerable, prestigious yet corrupt, essential to Tamrielic society, yet failing in its core mission. It limped through the Oblivion crisis and emerged on the other side fundamentally changed, its authority questioned, its future uncertain. The Fourth Era would bring the final reckoning. But before we discuss that collapse, we must understand the precipitating event, the necromancy ban, and the war it created within the guild itself. Chapter 8. The Necromancy Ban, an Internal War. The decision to ban necromancy from the Mages Guild represents one of the most controversial and consequential policy changes in the organization's history. It was born from legitimate concerns about dark magic and Daedric influence during the late Third Era, but its execution created a schism that would never heal. To understand why Hannibal Traven made this decision, we must first understand the man himself. Traven was a conservative mage, trained in traditional schools of magic, devoted to the teachings of the divines, particularly Arcane. He viewed necromancy not as morally neutral magic, but as a fundamental corruption, a practice that violated the natural order and enslaved souls that should be free to pass to their proper afterlife. When Traven became Archmage in the early years of the Fourth Era, he inherited a guild that was already deeply conflicted about necromancy. The practice remained legal in some provinces, forbidden in others. Some guild members practiced it openly. Others studied it in secret. Still others campaigned vigorously for its prohibition. The guild's official position was muddled, attempting to accommodate all viewpoints and satisfying no one. The Oblivion Crisis forced Traven's hand. As reports came in of necromancers supporting Daedric cults, of souls being harvested to fuel Oblivion Gates, of the Worm cult actively working to further Mehrunes Dagon's invasion, Traven concluded that half measures were no longer acceptable. The guild had to take a clear, unambiguous stance. Necromancy was dark magic, and those who practiced it were enemies of Tamriel itself. The ban was announced suddenly, with little warning and no consultation with the broader guild membership. One day, necromancy was a controversial but tolerated practice. The next, it was grounds for immediate expulsion. All guild members who practiced necromancy, regardless of their jurisdiction's local laws, were given a simple choice: renounce the practice completely or leave the guild. Hundreds chose to leave. Some did so reluctantly, forced to choose between their life's work and their guild membership. Others left angrily, feeling betrayed by an organization they had served loyally. Still others departed eagerly, having found Traven's guild too restrictive, too moralistic, too concerned with arbitrary rules about what magic should and shouldn't be practiced. The expelled necromancers scattered across Tamriel. Some attempted to continue practicing independently, setting up shops or taking on private clients. Others sought employment with noble houses or institutions that were more accepting of their craft. And many, finding no legitimate options, turned to the only organization that would welcome them, the Order of the Black Worm. Manimarco must have laughed when he learned of Traven's ban. In one stroke, the Archmage had accomplished what the King of Worms had spent centuries trying to achieve. He had driven talented, trained necromancers directly into the cult's waiting arms. These weren't hedge wizards or desperate amateurs. These were guild-trained mages with years of experience, knowledge of guild security measures, and personal grievances against the organization that had cast them out. The cult's recruitment pitch was simple and effective. The Mages Guild has betrayed you. They cast you out for practicing magic they themselves once taught. We offer something better, a place where your talents are valued, where necromancy is not just tolerated, but celebrated, where you can pursue your studies without fear of persecution. Join us and help us teach the guild the price of their narrow-mindedness. The intelligence, these new recruits provided was devastating. They knew which guild halls held valuable artifacts. They knew the schedules and patrol routes of guard details. They knew which guild members were sympathetic to necromancy and might be turned into spies. They knew the locations of hidden vaults, the weaknesses in defensive wards, the political divisions that could be exploited. Mannimarco used this intelligence to launch a series of coordinated attacks. The assault on Bruma's guild hall saw multiple members killed and several artifacts stolen. In Cheydinhall, the entire staff was slaughtered in a single night. The Skingrad Hall was infiltrated by a spy who had served there for years, trusted by everyone, who opened the doors to cult members and helped them steal the Bloodworm Helm. In Coral, the Guildmaster herself turned out to be a cult plant, having deceived her colleagues for years while working to further Mannimarco's plans. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical losses. Guild members could no longer trust each other. Any colleague could be a potential traitor. Every stranger seeking to join could be a cult infiltrator. The paranoia was justified. There really were spies within the guild, but it poisoned the atmosphere of cooperation and shared purpose that had once characterized guild culture. Traven responded to these attacks with increasingly desperate measures. He fortified the Arcane University, turning it into a fortress. He restricted access to information, limiting what even high-ranking members could know. He instituted loyalty oaths and magical screenings, but each security measure further alienated guild members, making them feel more like suspects than colleagues. The broader magical community watched this conflict with concern. The College of Winterhold maintained its independence and its more moderate stance on necromancy, neither embracing the practice nor banning it outright. The Telvanni of Morrowind, who had always practiced necromancy openly, viewed Traven's ban as further evidence of the guild's foolishness. Independent mages across Tamriel quietly reconsidered whether guild membership was worth the restrictions and dangers. Traven's most controversial decision came when he realized the guild couldn't win through conventional means. The worm cult was too well informed, too well prepared, too numerous. Every guild operation against them seemed to be anticipated. Every defensive measure was circumvented. Mannimarco was always one step ahead. In desperation, Traven turned to a forbidden practice himself. He used necromancy to interrogate the dead. Specifically, he sacrificed his own life to commune with souls that had been claimed by Mannimarco, hoping to learn the King of Worms' plans. The irony was not lost on anyone. The Archmage who had banned necromancy, who had expelled hundreds for practicing it, ultimately used it himself in the guild's darkest hour. The information Traven gained through this sacrifice proved crucial. He learned about the ritual Mannimarco was planning, about the artifacts needed to complete it, about the King of Worms' ultimate goal. This intelligence allowed the hero of Kvatch to anticipate Mannimarco's moves and ultimately confront him in Echo Cave before the ritual could be completed. But Traven's death left the guild leaderless at its most vulnerable moment. Raminus Polus, the master wizard of the Arcane University, served as interim leader, but he lacked Traven's authority and strength of will. The guild was drifting, its members demoralized, its future uncertain. When the hero of Kvatch defeated Mannimarco and was proclaimed the new Archmage, there was hope for renewal. Perhaps this champion, who had proven themselves against the greatest threats Tamriel had ever faced, could restore the guild to its former glory. Perhaps the necromancy ban could be re-evaluated now that the immediate crisis had passed. Perhaps the expelled members could be invited back. The wounds could heal. The guild could move forward united. But it was too late. The damage was too severe, the divisions too deep. The necromancy ban had fractured the guild in ways that couldn't be repaired. And the larger political situation, the collapse of the Septim dynasty, the succession crisis, the chaos engulfing the empire, meant the guild had lost the imperial support that had sustained it for centuries. The ban on necromancy was meant to strengthen the guild by removing a corrupting influence. Instead, it became the catalyst for the organization's destruction. It drove talented mages to the enemy. It created paranoia and mistrust within guild ranks. It demonstrated that the guild's leadership had become disconnected from its membership, willing to impose sweeping changes without consultation or consideration of consequences. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, we can see how the situation might have been handled differently. A more gradual approach, with genuine dialogue and compromise. Better security measures that didn't rely on mass expulsions. Recognition that necromancy, while dangerous, could be regulated rather than banned outright. Partnership with groups like the Priests of Arcane rather than attempting to solve the problem through guild action alone. But Hannibal Traven was a man of conviction, not compromise. He saw necromancy as evil and acted accordingly. His intentions were pure. He genuinely believed he was protecting the guild and serving the greater good. His execution was disastrous, leading directly to the deaths of hundreds and contributing to the guild's eventual collapse. The necromancy ban stands as a cautionary tale about good intentions producing terrible outcomes, about the dangers of absolutist thinking in complex situations, about how institutional rigidity can destroy what flexibility might have preserved, and about how, sometimes, the cure can be worse than the disease. The guild survived the immediate crisis, barely. But it emerged weaker, divided, its reputation tarnished. And in the years that followed, as the empire fractured and provincial powers reasserted themselves, the guild would find that survival alone was not enough. The golden age was over. The long decline had begun. And within a few decades, the Mages Guild itself would be nothing but a memory, replaced by organizations that learned from its mistakes while repeating others of their own. Chapter 9. The Fall of the Guild, Dissolution and Aftermath. The Mages Guild did not fall in a single catastrophic moment. It crumbled gradually, piece by piece, as the foundations that had sustained it for over a millennium gave way beneath the weight of political chaos and internal decay. The Oblivion Crisis marked the beginning of the end. When Martin Septim sacrificed himself to banish Mehrunes Dagon, when the dragonfires were forever extinguished and the amulet of kings shattered, the Septim dynasty ended. The empire that had supported the guild for centuries was suddenly leaderless, plunged into a succession crisis that would last for years. The guild had always relied on imperial authority for its legitimacy and protection. The original charter, granted by King Rilis XII, had been supplemented by imperial decrees recognizing the guild's special status, granting it monopolies on certain magical services, protecting it from local interference. When the central imperial authority collapsed, these protections became meaningless. Provincial rulers, freed from imperial oversight, began asserting their own authority over magical practice within their borders. Some simply refused to recognize guild privileges. Others imposed new taxes and restrictions. Still others actively worked to drive the guild out, preferring to support local magical traditions or establish their own institutions. The guild's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Without imperial subsidies, and with provinces refusing to honor previous agreements, many guild halls found themselves struggling to pay rent, purchase supplies, and compensate their members. Some halls closed voluntarily. Others were seized by local authorities for unpaid debts. The network that had once spanned all of Tamriel contracted, retreating to areas where it still had sufficient support to continue operations. Internal problems compounded external pressures. The political infighting that had plagued the guild throughout the Third Era intensified. With the organization's survival in question, ambitious mages saw opportunities for personal advancement by positioning themselves as saviors who could lead the guild into a new era. The Council of Mages became paralyzed by factional disputes. Some members advocated for radical reforms. Others insisted on maintaining tradition. Still others argued the guild should dissolve voluntarily and allow new organizations to rise from its ashes. The quality of guild services continued to decline. The best mages left for better opportunities elsewhere. Those who remained were often the least talented or most desperate. Horror stories multiplied, potions that caused harm rather than healing, enchantments that failed catastrophically, training that left students unprepared for actual magical practice. The guild's reputation, already damaged by the Oblivion Crisis and the necromancy ban, suffered further. In Morrowind, the situation was particularly dire. The guild had always struggled in Dunmer territory, competing against native traditions like House Telvanni. When the Ministry of Truth crashed into Vivek City in 4E5, destroying much of the capital, guild operations were severely disrupted. The subsequent eruption of Red Mountain and the Argonian invasion devastated the province. Guild halls were destroyed, along with everything else. The few that survived found themselves in a land that could barely support its own population, let alone foreign magical organizations. Skyrim's guild operations had never been particularly strong, always overshadowed by the College of Winterhold. When the Great Collapse destroyed much of Winterhold in 4E122, the guild lost what little presence it still maintained in the province. The college survived because its defensive wards held, but this only emphasized the superiority of independent magical institutions over the failing guild. In Cyrodiil, the heart of the empire and the guild's traditional stronghold, the situation was chaotic. The succession crisis produced multiple claimants to the throne, each backed by different factions. The Mages Guild tried to maintain neutrality, but this satisfied no one. Each faction expected the guild to support their candidate, and when it didn't, they viewed it as opposition. Guild halls were caught in the crossfire of civil conflicts, and no central authority was strong enough to protect them. The final blow came not from external enemies, but from within. In 4E40, the Council of Mages voted to dissolve the Mages Guild as a unified organization. The vote was not unanimous. Indeed, it was bitterly contested, but the majority recognized that the institution could no longer function in its current form. The infrastructure was gone. The funding had dried up. The imperial support that had sustained the guild for centuries had vanished. Attempting to maintain the facade of a unified organization was futile. The dissolution was messy and acrimonious. Disputes erupted over who owned what assets, which local organizations could claim descent from the guild, who had the right to use guild titles and symbols. Former colleagues became bitter enemies, accusing each other of betraying Galerion's legacy or of clinging foolishly to a dead institution. Some guild halls attempted to continue operating independently as local magical societies. A few succeeded, particularly in areas with strong community support. Most failed within a few years, unable to compete with newer organizations that weren't burdened by the guild's legacy and reputation. The Arcane University in the Imperial City survived in diminished form, eventually becoming an independent institution affiliated with whoever currently held the Ruby Throne. Its libraries remain valuable resources, though much knowledge was lost during the chaotic transition. Its laboratories continued operating, though with fewer resources and less ambitious research programs. But it was no longer the beating heart of a continent-spanning organization. It was just one magical institution among many, distinguished mainly by its history. Into the vacuum left by the guild's dissolution stepped two new organizations, each claiming to represent the proper evolution of magical practice in the Fourth Era: the Synod and the College of Whispers. Both consisted largely of former guild members, and both traced their legitimacy back to guild traditions. But they represented fundamentally different visions of what magic should be and how mages should organize themselves. The guild's dissolution represented more than just the end of an institution. It marked the end of an ideal, that magic could be truly democratized, that mages from all provinces and backgrounds could unite under a common banner, that magical knowledge could be standardized and shared freely across all of Tamriel. In its place came fragmentation. Regional magical traditions reasserted themselves. The Telvanni in Morrowind, the College of Winterhold in Skyrim, the Synod and College of Whispers competing for influence in Cyrodiil and beyond. Independent mages operating without affiliation to any organization. This fragmentation meant that magic became, once again, something available primarily to those with wealth, connections, or exceptional talent. The common folk who had benefited from guild services found themselves shut out. Some historians argue the guild's dissolution was inevitable, that no organization could have survived the collapse of the Septim dynasty and the chaos of the early Fourth Era. Others contend that better leadership, more flexible policies, and less internal conflict could have allowed the guild to adapt and endure. We will never know. What we know is that by 4E50, the Mages Guild was effectively dead, its legacy disputed. its future uncertain. Looking back across the span of over 1,000 years, from the Guild's founding in 2E 230 to its dissolution in 4E 40, we can see an arc that mirrors the broader history of Tamriel itself. The second era saw idealism and expansion. The third era brought consolidation and corruption. The fourth era forced reckoning and collapse. Vanus Galerion's vision was noble. Magic as a public good, knowledge shared rather than hoarded, opportunity available to all who proved worthy. For a time, that vision was realized. Thousands of mages trained in guild halls. Millions benefited from guild services. Magic became woven into the fabric of everyday life across Tamriel. But institutions are built and maintained by fallible people. The guild was no exception. Political ambition corrupted its mission. Bureaucracy stifled its innovation. Inflexibility prevented necessary adaptation. And when the external supports that had sustained it collapsed, the internal rot was exposed. The guild story is a tragedy, but not a simple one. It achieved genuine good in the world. It also failed in crucial ways. It transformed magical practice, while ultimately being unable to sustain its own transformation. It created opportunities while entrenching new hierarchies. It was both more and less than what its founder had dreamed, and from its ashes, new organizations would rise, each attempting to learn from the guild's mistakes, while inevitably making new ones of their own. Chapter 10: The Synod, Imperial Authority and Conservative Magic. When the Mages Guild dissolved in the early Fourth Era, the question of who would inherit its legacy consumed the magical community. Two major factions emerged from the chaos, each claiming to represent the Guild's true spirit, while fundamentally disagreeing about what that spirit was. The Synod positioned itself as the legitimate successor to the Mages Guild, the organization that maintained continuity with Guild traditions while adapting to Fourth Era realities. Its members were predominantly former Guild higher-ups, council members, guild masters, senior researchers from the Arcane University. These were mages who had thrived under the old system and saw themselves as its natural heirs. The organization took its name from its governing structure. Rather than having a single archmage with absolute authority, the Synod was led by a council of equals, each member supposedly having equal voice in decisions. This was meant to prevent the kind of autocratic errors that had characterized the Guild's final years, particularly Hannibal Traven's unilateral necromancy ban. In practice, the Synod's council was as political as any other governing body. Factions formed around charismatic leaders. Votes were traded for favors. Decisions reflected the personal ambitions of council members as much as any principled stance. The Synod had replaced one form of political dysfunction with another, though its members would never admit this publicly. The Synod's philosophical approach to magic was fundamentally conservative. They advocated for caution, regulation, and careful study before implementing new techniques. They emphasized traditional schools of magic, destruction, restoration, alteration, conjuration, illusion, and viewed experimentation with skepticism. To them, magic was something to be mastered through discipline and study, not something to be innovated recklessly. This conservatism extended to their view of who should practice magic. The Synod maintained high standards for membership, requiring extensive training and demonstrated competence. They argued this was necessary for public safety. Untrained mages were dangerous to themselves and others. Critics countered that these high barriers recreated the elitism that Galerion had fought against, making magic once again the domain of those who could afford lengthy apprenticeships or academic training. The Synod worked hard to cultivate relationships with imperial authorities. They positioned themselves as the responsible, trustworthy option for magical regulation and service. When provincial governments needed magical expertise, the Synod offered it. When disputes arose over magical practices, the Synod provided arbitration. When research needed funding, the Synod demonstrated how their work served imperial interests. This political strategy proved effective in Cyrodiil and some other provinces. The Synod gained official recognition, monopolies on certain magical services, and protection from competition. They established their headquarters in the imperial city, claiming some of the former Arcane University facilities. They opened halls in major cities across the empire, particularly in areas where imperial authority remained strong. But this close relationship with political power came at a cost. The Synod became viewed as an arm of the imperial government, rather than an independent organization serving the magical community. Their decisions appeared driven by political considerations rather than magical principles, and their conservative approach to magic meant they were often behind the cutting edge, replicating known techniques rather than pushing boundaries. The Synod's relationship with necromancy was particularly telling. They maintained Hannibal Treven's ban, arguing that necromancy was inherently corrupt and dangerous. This stance aligned with imperial policy and the teachings of the Church, making it politically safe. But it also meant the Synod lost potential members who saw necromancy as simply another school of magic, no more inherently evil than destruction or conjuration. In Skyrim, the Synod's presence was minimal. They established a small outpost in Dawnstar and conducted some research expeditions, but they never seriously competed with the College of Winterhold. The college's independence and reputation made it the obvious choice for Nordic mages, and the Synod wisely didn't waste resources trying to change that. The Synod's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness: its bureaucracy. The organization had extensive procedures for everything from admitting new members to approving research proposals to handling complaints about services. This provided structure and accountability, preventing the kind of abuses that had plagued the late-era Mages Guild. But it also made the Synod slow, unwieldy, unable to respond quickly to emerging situations. A famous example illustrates this perfectly. When reports surfaced of unusual magical phenomena in Skyrim in 4E201, the Synod sent a research team to investigate. This team brought the proper authorization forms, the approved equipment, and a detailed research protocol. They also brought a rigid adherence to procedure that made them a laughingstock. When confronted by the Dragonborn, their research methods seemed bureaucratic to the point of absurdity. The Synod's rivalry with the College of Whispers defined much of its energy during the Fourth Era. The two organizations competed for members, resources, political influence, and recognition as the true heir to the Mages Guild. This competition sometimes spurred both to greater achievements, but more often, it simply wasted time and resources that could have been spent on actual magical advancement. Members of the Synod wore distinctive robes and carried official documentation proving their affiliation. They emphasized their credentials, their official recognition, their adherence to proper procedures. To join the Synod was to join an established, respectable institution with centuries of tradition behind it, or so they claimed. Critics noted that those centuries of tradition included the Mages Guild's corruption and ultimate failure, making them questionable sources of pride. The Synod's research focus leaned heavily toward practical applications that could demonstrate value to their political patrons. They studied ways to make crops grow better, to purify water, to enhance construction materials, to support military operations. This was useful work, certainly, but it lacked the ambition and vision that had characterized the Guild at its best. The Synod was content to be competent and useful. They had abandoned any pretense of transforming magical practice or expanding the boundaries of what was possible. By the time of the events in Skyrim in 4E 201, the Synod had existed for over 150 years. It had achieved a stable, if uninspiring place in Tamrielic society. It trained mages, it provided magical services, it conducted research, it advised governments. It was respectable, boring, bureaucratic, and utterly lacking in the idealism that had driven Vanus Galerion to found the Mages Guild. The Synod represented safety and stability in a chaotic era. For mages who valued those qualities, who wanted clear rules and established procedures, who believed magic should be carefully regulated, the Synod was an excellent choice. It offered structure, legitimacy, and the backing of imperial authority. But for those who remembered what the Mages Guild had been at its best, the Synod was a disappointment. It had all the Guild's bureaucratic problems without its sense of mission. It maintained barriers to magical education while abandoning the Guild's commitment to accessibility. It played politics effectively while losing sight of why magical organizations existed in the first place. The Synod endured because it was useful to those in power and because it provided genuine, if uninspired, services to its clients. But it never captured hearts the way the original Mages Guild had. It was a practical institution for a practical age, built by administrators rather than visionaries. And across Tamriel, wherever Synod mages worked, they were watched by members of the College of Whispers, their rivals, and their Dark Mirror, an organization that had taken all the lessons the Synod learned and drawn exactly opposite conclusions. Chapter 11. The College of Whispers, Embracing the Forbidden, where the Synod sought legitimacy through political connections and conservative magical practice. The College of Whispers pursued power through forbidden knowledge and secretive methods. The two organizations represented fundamentally opposed philosophies about the proper relationship between mages and society, between magical practice and political authority. The College of Whispers formed from guild members who rejected the direction the Synod represented. They saw the Synod's conservatism as cowardice, its political maneuvering as collaboration with oppressive authority, its high barriers to membership as elitism of the worst kind. The The college positioned itself as the organization for mages who wanted to push boundaries, who refused to accept arbitrary limitations on magical inquiry, who believed power came from knowledge rather than credentials. The very name College of Whispers signaled their approach. They operated quietly, maintaining secrecy about their membership, locations, and activities. This wasn't because they saw themselves as criminals, though others often did. They simply recognized that much valuable magical knowledge was considered dangerous or forbidden by conventional authorities. To pursue that knowledge required discretion. The college's attitude toward necromancy exemplified their philosophy. While the Synod maintained Hannibal Traven's ban, the College of Whispers welcomed necromancers. They argued that necromancy was simply another school of magic, morally neutral in itself, valuable for its practical applications and theoretical insights. The hysteria around necromancy, they contended, was based on religious superstition and political control rather than genuine ethical concerns. This stance made the college immediately suspect in many circles. Critics accused them of being little better than the worm cult, of trafficking in dark magic, of enslaving souls. The college countered that they practiced necromancy responsibly, with proper procedures and ethical guidelines. They pointed out that the Dunmer had practiced necromancy openly for millennia without becoming monsters. The blanket prohibition was arbitrary and counterproductive. The debate was never resolved, but the college's willingness to embrace necromancy attracted many talented mages who had been expelled from the guild or refused to join the synod. These practitioners brought expertise and knowledge that the college leveraged into genuine magical advancement. Whatever one's moral stance on necromancy, the college's research in that field was undeniably sophisticated. But necromancy was only part of the college's broader approach. They studied all forms of magic that other institutions deemed too dangerous or controversial. Daedric conjuration, beyond the simple summoning of lesser Daedra. Blood magic and its applications. Experimental techniques that might fail catastrophically, but might also unlock new capabilities. The boundaries of what the mind could endure when exposed to certain knowledge. The college pursued it all with enthusiasm that others called reckless. This research produced both breakthroughs and disasters. College members developed new spells and techniques that expanded magical capabilities. They also suffered accidents, corruption, madness, and death at rates far higher than the synod. The college accepted these casualties as the cost of genuine progress. The synod plays it safe and discovers nothing, they argued. We take risks and advance the art. The college's organizational structure was deliberately opaque. Unlike the synod with its public council, the college's leadership remained hidden. Members knew only their immediate contacts, creating a cell-based structure that protected the organization from infiltration or suppression. Even many college members didn't know who actually led the organization or where its central facilities were located. This secretiveness served practical purposes, but also created problems. Without transparency, abuse could flourish unchecked. Without clear leadership, the college sometimes pursued contradictory goals. Individual cells might be doing excellent work, while others engaged in genuinely dangerous practices with no oversight. The college's defenders called this operational freedom. Its critics called it criminal negligence. The college's relationship with political authorities was complicated. They lacked the synod's official recognition and were sometimes actively persecuted. Some provinces banned college membership outright. Others tolerated them as long as they operated discreetly. The college adapted to each situation, sometimes working openly where they could, other times going underground. This outsider status had advantages. The college wasn't beholden to political patrons and could pursue research based purely on magical merit, rather than what would please the current government. They attracted independent-minded mages who chafed under authority, and their secretive methods meant they could continue operating even in hostile environments. But it also meant the college struggled with resources. The synod could secure government contracts and wealthy patrons. The college had to fund itself through less legitimate means, selling forbidden knowledge, offering services the synod wouldn't provide, occasionally engaging in outright criminal activity when necessary. This created a moral grey area that made the organization genuinely problematic, not merely misunderstood. The College of Whispers clashed repeatedly with the Vigilance of Stendar, a religious order dedicated to hunting Daedra worshippers and dark mages. The Vigilance viewed college members as corrupted practitioners who had fallen to forbidden arts. College members viewed the Vigilance as ignorant zealots who feared what they didn't understand. The conflict occasionally turned violent, with Vigilance raiding suspected college operations and college members retaliating against vigilant chapter houses. In Skyrim, during the Fourth Era, both the Synod and College of Whispers maintained minimal presence, overshadowed by the College of Winterhold. But they competed fiercely for influence elsewhere. When mages chose to affiliate with one organization over the other, they were making a statement about their magical philosophy. Regulated caution versus exploratory risk, political legitimacy versus intellectual freedom, safety versus power. The college's most controversial practices involved the boundaries of acceptable magical experimentation. They studied soul magic extensively, pushing beyond what the Synod deemed ethical. They experimented with consciousness transfer, attempting to move awareness between bodies. They investigated the nature of divine magic, seeking to understand and replicate powers that religions claimed only their deities could grant. They delved into the mysteries of Chim and the Dwemer and other topics that drove lesser minds mad. Some of these investigations produced valuable knowledge. Others ended in tragedy. The college maintained that all knowledge was worth pursuing, that the risks were acceptable given the potential rewards. Their critics argued this attitude reflected dangerous hubris, the same prideful certainty that had led past mages to catastrophe. The rivalry between the Synod and the College of Whispers consumed enormous energy from both organizations. They competed for members, with each trying to recruit the most talented young mages. They competed for artifacts, racing to acquire items from ruins and collectors. They competed for political influence, each trying to undermine the other's reputation and credibility. This rivalry was arguably counterproductive for the magical community as a whole, dividing resources and attention that could have been directed toward actual advancement. But the competition also spurred both organizations to greater achievements than either might have accomplished alone. The Synod's research improved because they couldn't afford to fall behind the college's discoveries. The college maintained some ethical standards because the Synod's criticism forced them to at least appear responsible. The tension between the two created a dynamic equilibrium that, while frustrating, probably served Tamriel better than if either had achieved total dominance. By 4E201, the College of Whispers had established itself as a permanent fixture of the Fourth Era magical landscape. It would never achieve the legitimacy of the Synod, but it didn't want that legitimacy. It would never operate openly in all provinces, but it found ways to work around restrictions. It would always be controversial, always suspected of dark dealings, always walking the line between innovative research and dangerous obsession. For certain mages, this was exactly what they wanted: an organization that wouldn't limit their investigations based on political considerations or moral panics, that valued results over credentials, that understood power came from knowledge rather than authority. The College of Whispers wasn't the Mages Guild reborn. It was something new, something that could only exist in the fractured landscape of Fourth Era Tamriel. And in the shadows, in hidden laboratories and secret sanctums, college members continued their work, pushing boundaries, taking risks, seeking power through knowledge regardless of cost. They whispered their secrets to each other, traded forbidden techniques, accumulated dangerous insights. The College of Whispers represented magic at its most ambitious and its most morally questionable. It was a testament to the idea that knowledge should be pursued without limits, and a warning about what happens when ethical considerations are dismissed as obstacles to progress. Chapter 12. The College of Winterhold, Independent and Enduring. While the Synod and College of Whispers fought over the Mages Guild's legacy, another institution had been training mages for far longer than either. The College of Winterhold stood isolated at the northern edge of Skyrim, enduring through the ages with a proud independence that predated Vanus Galerion's revolutionary vision. The origins of the college are shrouded in mystery, lost to the ages before reliable historical records. Some claim it was founded in the Merethic era, making it older than the Empire itself. Others suggest it dates to the early First Era. What is certain is that by the time the Mages Guild was established in 2E230, the College of Winterhold had already been training Nordic mages for centuries, maybe millennia. The college's relationship with the city of Winterhold and with Skyrim generally was always complicated. Nords traditionally viewed magic with suspicion, preferring the straightforward honesty of blade and shield to what they saw as the deceptive tricks of spellcasters. A true Nord needs no magic, was a common saying, reflecting deep cultural attitudes. Yet even Nords recognized that magic had its uses. Healing the injured, warding against supernatural threats, dealing with problems that couldn't be solved through physical prowess alone. And so the college was tolerated, kept at arm's length on the outskirts of Winterhold, neither fully embraced nor actively persecuted. The college's isolation was both burden and blessing. Located on a precarious stone bridge extending from Winterhold toward the Sea of Ghosts, the college was difficult to access, cut off from the mainland by treacherous paths and brutal weather. This isolation protected it from casual interference, but also limited its influence and resources. The college could not spread across Skyrim as the Mages Guild did across other provinces. It remained a single institution, drawing students who were dedicated enough to make the dangerous journey north. Unlike the Mages Guild, the college never sought to commercialize magic or make it widely accessible. It was, first and foremost, an academy. Its purpose was to train serious students in magical theory and practice, to conduct research, to preserve knowledge. It offered some services to outsiders, enchanting, spell teaching, alchemy, but these were secondary to its educational mission. The college's standards were high. Prospective students had to demonstrate significant magical ability just to gain entry. Once admitted, they faced rigorous training that emphasized mastery over breadth. The college produced fewer graduates than the Mages Guild, but those graduates were typically very skilled practitioners who had received education in both practical spellcasting and theoretical foundations. The organizational structure was relatively simple. At the top was the Archmage, selected by the faculty from among their own ranks. Below were various specialized instructors, a master of destruction, a master of alteration, and so forth, each responsible for teaching their school of magic. Students progressed through ranks based on demonstrated ability, from apprentice to journeyman to expert, eventually becoming full mages if they completed their training. The college's curriculum emphasized both practical application and theoretical understanding. Students didn't just learn to cast spells. They learned why those spells worked, the principles underlying magical effects, the relationship between magicka and the physical world. This depth of education meant college graduates often had a more sophisticated understanding of magic than their Mages Guild counterparts, even if their range of practical skills was sometimes narrower. Research at the college focused on pure magical theory rather than commercial applications. Faculty members investigated fundamental questions about the nature of magic, consciousness, reality itself. The Augur of Dunlane, a mysterious entity that existed as pure magical energy, served as both subject of study and source of cryptic wisdom. The college's library contained volumes dating back centuries, some so dangerous that access was strictly controlled. The college maintained a complicated relationship with necromancy. Unlike the Mages Guild's eventual ban or the Synod's prohibition, the college took a more nuanced position. Necromancy was taught as part of the conjuration curriculum, but with strict ethical guidelines. Students learned the theory and practice, but were expected to understand why soul trapping and undead animation were considered problematic. The college's approach was educational rather than prohibitive. Teach students about necromancy so they understand it, but also teach them why using it carelessly was dangerous and wrong. This moderate stance meant the college attracted some students who had been expelled from other institutions for necromantic practice. It also meant the college was sometimes accused of being too permissive. But the college's leadership believed that forbidding knowledge only made it more attractive. that education was better than prohibition. This philosophy distinguished them from both the Synod's conservatism and the College of Whispers' permissiveness. When the Mages Guild dissolved in the early Fourth Era, the College of Winterhold was barely affected. They had never been part of the guild structure, had never relied on its resources or authority. The political chaos in Cyrodiil meant nothing in distant Skyrim. The college simply continued as it always had, training students, conducting research, maintaining its ancient traditions. The Great Collapse of 4E122 nearly destroyed everything. In a single catastrophic event, most of the city of Winterhold fell into the Sea of Ghosts. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled and slid into the icy waters. Hundreds of people died. The city was reduced to a handful of structures, a shadow of its former self. The college survived only because its protective wards held. While the rest of Winterhold collapsed, the college's bridge and buildings remained intact, sheltered by magic that had been carefully maintained for generations. This should have been seen as a triumph of magical knowledge, proof of the college's skill and power. Instead, the city's survivors blamed the college for the disaster. Rumors spread that a magical experiment had gone wrong, that the mages had caused the collapse through reckless research. These accusations were never proven, and most evidence suggests the collapse was a natural disaster, possibly related to the eruption of Red Mountain in Morrowind years earlier. But grief and fear needed a target, and the college was convenient. Relations between the college and Winterhold's surviving population became openly hostile. The Jarl and citizens wanted the college disbanded, its members expelled, the bridge destroyed. Only the college's protected status under ancient agreements prevented direct action. But the atmosphere was poisonous. Mages were harassed when they ventured into town. The college's reputation across Skyrim suffered. Recruitment became difficult as families warned their children against studying magic. The college's isolation, once merely geographical, became social and political as well. They endured, but barely, with diminishing resources and growing suspicion from the world around them. The faculty debated whether to relocate, to abandon Winterhold entirely and establish themselves elsewhere. But the college's history was bound to this place, and leaving felt like surrender. By 4E201, when the last Dragonborn arrived in Skyrim, the college was in crisis. The current Archmage, Aaron, had been killed investigating the mystery of Arthol. His successor, Savos Aaron, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances while investigating reports of a powerful magical artifact. The college was leaderless, threatened by forces it didn't fully understand, still dealing with hostility from Winterhold survivors. Into this chaos came the Dragonborn, a figure of destiny whose very existence transcended normal magical categories. Through a series of events involving the Eye of Magnus, an ancient and immensely powerful artifact, the Dragonborn helped save the college from the Thalmor agent Ancano, who had sought to use the Eye's power for his own purposes. The Dragonborn was named Archmage, an outsider elevated to leadership of Skyrim's oldest magical institution. This unusual appointment reflected the college's desperate situation, but also its flexibility. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the Synod or the Mages Guild at its worst, the college could recognize exceptional ability regardless of conventional credentials. The Dragonborn might not have had years of formal magical training, but their power was undeniable. Their results spoke for themselves. Under new leadership, the college began to stabilize. Research into the Eye of Magnus and related phenomena continued. Relations with Winterhold remained strained, but didn't deteriorate further. The college maintained its independence from both the Synod and the College of Whispers, refusing to be drawn into their rivalry. It stood as a third option for Nordic mages and others who valued pure research and academic rigor over political considerations. The College of Winterhold's endurance across multiple eras, surviving catastrophes that destroyed other institutions, testified to the strength of its model. By refusing to commercialize magic or seek political power, by focusing on education and research, by maintaining high standards and deep traditions, the college created something more resilient than the sprawling but fragile Mages Guild. It was never accessible the way Galerion had wanted magic to be. A farmer's child with talent might never make the journey to Winterhold, might never gain admission even if they did. The college served the few rather than the many, but those few received education of exceptional quality, training that prepared them not just to cast spells, but to understand magic at its deepest levels. The college represented an alternative vision of what a magical institution could be. Not a guild offering services for coin, not a political organization seeking influence, but an academy dedicated to knowledge for its own sake. This vision had limitations and costs, but it also had a purity that the commercial and political organizations lacked. In the frozen north, on a bridge extending toward the Sea of Ghosts, surrounded by the ruins of what Winterhold had been, the college endured. Students still arrived, drawn by reputation and the promise of genuine learning. Faculty still taught, passing down knowledge accumulated over centuries. Researchers still pushed boundaries, seeking to understand the fundamental nature of magic and reality. The College of Winterhold proved that magical institutions didn't have to follow the Mages Guild's model to succeed. Independence, high standards, focus on education rather than commerce. These provided their own form of strength. The college would never spread across Tamriel as the guild had, but it also wouldn't collapse as the guild did, because it had built itself on foundations that didn't depend on political favor or commercial success. In a world where the Mages Guild was dead, where the Synod and College of Whispers fought over its legacy, the College of Winterhold simply continued, unchanged, unmoved, eternal as the northern ice. And for those who valued knowledge above all else, who sought to understand rather than merely use magic, the college remained what it had always been, a beacon in the darkness, calling to those brave enough to answer. Chapter 13. Legacy and Lessons. What the Guild taught us. The story of the Mages Guild spans over 1,000 years, from its revolutionary founding in 2E230 to its dissolution in 4E40 and the fractured landscape that followed. It is a story of vision and corruption, of genuine achievement and catastrophic failure, of how noble intentions can be perverted by politics and pride. What lessons can we draw from this long history? What does the Guild's rise and fall teach us about magic, about institutions, about power itself? First, consider what the Guild achieved. Vanus Galerion's vision of democratized magic was genuinely revolutionary. Before the Guild, magical knowledge was hoarded by secretive orders like the Psijics, or controlled by noble families who passed it down through private tutors, or practiced by isolated wizards who guarded their secrets jealously. Common folk had no access to magical training or services except through luck or extraordinary circumstances. The Guild changed this fundamentally. For the first time in Tamrielic history, anyone with talent and discipline could receive magical training. Anyone with coin could purchase potions, enchantments, and spell instruction. Magic became a profession rather than a mystery, a service rather than a privilege. This transformation touched every province, every social class, every aspect of life across Tamriel. Thousands of mages received training through the Guild. Millions benefited from its services. New spells were developed. Magical techniques were refined and standardized. Knowledge was shared rather than hoarded. For several centuries, the Guild made magic more accessible and better understood than it had ever been before. This was a genuine achievement, one we should not diminish, even as we examine the Guild's failures. Galerion's vision worked for a time. The dream of magic as a public good available to all was realized. That it ultimately failed doesn't negate the genuine good it accomplished while it endured, but the failures are instructive precisely because they emerged from the same system that created the successes. The Guild structure, which allowed it to spread across Tamriel and standardize magical practice, also created a bureaucracy that became increasingly disconnected from its mission. The political connections that provided protection and authority also led to corruption and compromise. The growth that brought magic to every province also diluted quality control and created competition between guild halls that should have been cooperating. The necromancy issue exemplifies how good intentions can produce terrible outcomes. Hannibal Traven genuinely believed that banning necromancy would protect the guild and serve the greater good. His assessment of necromancy as dangerous and corrupting was not unreasonable. The worm cult's activities provided ample evidence of necromancy's potential for evil. But by implementing a blanket ban without consultation or nuance, by expelling hundreds of members overnight, Traven created the very disaster he hoped to prevent. The expelled necromancers flocked to Mannimarco, strengthening the cult dramatically. The ban divided the guild internally, creating paranoia and resentment. And ultimately, Traven himself used necromancy in the guild's final desperate hours, undermining his own moral stance. The lesson here is not that necromancy should have been permitted without restriction, nor that it should have been banned earlier. The lesson is that complex problems require nuanced solutions, that absolutism often fails even when the underlying concern is legitimate, and that institutions need flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. The Guild's dissolution demonstrates how even established institutions can collapse when their foundations are eroded. The Guild had endured for over a millennium. It had survived wars, disasters, political upheavals. But when the Septim dynasty ended and imperial authority collapsed, the guild discovered that it had become dependent on that authority. Without imperial protection and subsidies, without a central government enforcing its monopolies and privileges, the guild couldn't sustain itself. This dependence on political power was a fundamental vulnerability. The College of Winterhold, by maintaining its independence, proved far more resilient. When the political landscape shifted, when the empire fractured, the college continued because it had built itself on foundations that didn't require imperial support. The guild, for all its size and influence, had built on sand. The rivalry between the Synod and College of Whispers shows how organizations can draw opposite lessons from the same history. Both emerged from the Mages Guild's dissolution. Both consisted largely of former guild members. Both claimed to represent the guild's true legacy, yet they developed completely opposed philosophies and approaches. The Synod saw the guild's failures as stemming from insufficient regulation and too much permissiveness. Their solution was conservative: high standards, strict rules, close political ties, prohibition of controversial practices. The College of Whispers saw the guild's failures as stemming from excessive caution and political compromise. Their solution was radical: embrace forbidden knowledge, operate secretly, reject political authority, study everything without arbitrary limits. Neither approach fully captured what made the guild work at its best. The Synod's conservatism prevented the innovation that had once characterized guild research. The College of Whispers' permissiveness created genuine dangers and ethical problems. Both organizations succeeded in some ways while failing in others, demonstrating that there was no simple answer to how magical institutions should operate. The College of Winterhold's endurance suggests that focus and independence matter more than size or influence. The college never spread beyond Skyrim. It never served millions. It never wielded political power. But by maintaining high standards, focusing on education rather than commerce, and refusing to compromise its principles for political gain, it created something more durable than the sprawling guild. Vanus Galerion's legacy is complicated. He revolutionized magical practice in Tamriel, making knowledge accessible and creating an institution that served the people for centuries. But he also grew disillusioned with what the guild became, recognizing how politics and ambition had corrupted his vision. His final act, leading an army against Manimarco and sacrificing himself to defeat the King of Worms, was both heroic and tragic. He died fighting against the darkness that in some ways grew from his own creation, from the decision to spread magical knowledge without fully anticipating how it might be misused. Manimarco's legacy is clearer, but no less enduring. The King of Worms represented everything dark and corrupt about magic: the enslavement of souls, the violation of death's sanctity, the pursuit of power without moral constraint. Yet he was undeniably brilliant, a genius who transformed himself into something beyond mortal limitations. He created an organization that survived his own defeats, spreading knowledge that could not be unlearned. And according to some accounts, he achieved a form of godhood, becoming the necromancer's moon itself. The tension between these two figures, between Galerion's idealism and Manimarco's ambition, between magic as public service and magic as personal power, between light and shadow, defined magical practice for over 1,000 years. It's a tension that continues in the Fourth Era through the organizations that inherited their legacy. Magic in Tamriel has always been morally neutral, a tool that can be used for good or evil depending on the wielder's intentions. But the institutions that regulate and teach magic are not neutral. They make choices about who can access magical knowledge, what practices are permitted, how power is distributed and controlled. These choices have consequences that ripple through societies and across generations. The Mages Guild made certain choices to democratize access while creating hierarchies, to seek political power while claiming to serve the public good, to regulate practice while maintaining inconsistent standards. Some of these choices produced genuine benefits. Others led to corruption and eventual collapse. The organizations that followed made different choices with their own benefits and costs. What endures beyond any particular institution is the fundamental human desire for knowledge and power that magic represents. As long as magic flows through Nirn, as long as individuals possess the talent and will to shape it, there will be mages. And as long as there are mages, there will be need for institutions to train them, regulate them, and channel their efforts toward constructive rather than destructive ends. The perfect magical institution probably doesn't exist. Every approach has flaws. Pure independence leads to isolation and irrelevance. Political connection leads to corruption and compromise. Strict regulation stifles innovation. Excessive permissiveness creates dangers. High standards exclude those who need training most. Low standards produce incompetent practitioners who endanger themselves and others. Perhaps the lesson is that diversity of institutions serves Tamriel better than any single dominant organization. The Synod provides structure for those who need it. The College of Whispers offers freedom for those willing to accept its risks. The College of Winterhold maintains traditions for those who value deep learning. Independent mages practice for those who prefer neither bureaucracy nor secrecy. This fractured landscape lacks the elegant unity of the Mages Guild at its height, but it may be more resilient precisely because of its diversity. The story of the Mages Guild is ultimately a human story, in the broadest sense of that term. It's about how even the best intentions can be corrupted by politics and pride, about how institutions that start with revolutionary visions can become conservative and self-serving, about how the pursuit of knowledge and power can lead to both enlightenment and darkness, about how what we build with such care can crumble when we stop maintaining it properly. In guild halls across Tamriel, now empty or repurposed or crumbling into ruins, you can still feel the presence of what once was. The apprentices who studied there, memorizing spells and mixing potions. The masters who taught them, passing down knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. The customers who came seeking help for problems mundane and magical. The researchers pushing boundaries, seeking to understand the fundamental nature of reality itself. All of that is gone now, or transformed into something new. The Mages Guild that Vanus Galerion founded exists only in history books and the memories of those old enough to remember it. But its influence persists in every magical institution that followed, in every mage who learned their craft through guild training, in every potion brewed using techniques the guild standardized, in every enchantment created with methods the guild refined. Magic itself endures, unchanged by human institutions and their failures. The schools of magic, destruction, restoration, alteration, conjuration, illusion, and yes, even necromancy, remain as they have always been, neutral tools, waiting to be wielded. Magicka flows through Nirn, as it has since the beginning, available to those with the knowledge and will to channel it. What has changed is how we organize ourselves around magic, how we teach it and regulate it and integrate it into society. The Mages Guild represented one answer to these questions, an answer that worked brilliantly for a time before ultimately failing. The institutions that followed represent other answers, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. And somewhere, in hidden laboratories and dusty libraries, in the College of Winterhold's ancient halls and the Synod's bureaucratic offices and the College of Whispers' secret sanctums, mages continue their eternal work. They study, they experiment, they teach, they push boundaries, they make mistakes and achieve breakthroughs. They serve the light or embrace the darkness or walk the grey path between. This is the legacy of the Mages Guild, not a perfect institution that endured forever, but a flawed human creation that changed the world before failing. A reminder that progress is possible but not permanent, that vision can transform society but cannot sustain itself without constant effort, that even the best of institutions must adapt or die. Close your eyes now. Feel the weight of all this history, 1,000 years of magical practice, of dreams and failures, and everything between. Feel the presence of Vanus Galerion, the escaped slave who became Archmagister and changed Tamriel forever. Feel the shadow of Manimarco, the brilliant student who chose darkness and became a god of death. And feel, most of all, the continuing presence of magic itself, flowing through this world, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to master it, offering power to those who seek it, regardless of whether they use that power for good or ill. The Mages Guild is gone, but magic endures, and as long as it endures, there will be those who seek to master it, to teach it, to share it, or hoard it, to use it in service of light or shadow. The story continues, as all stories do, written by each new generation of mages who must decide for themselves what magic means and how it should be wielded. And in that continuing story, perhaps we can do better. Perhaps we can learn from both the successes and the failures, can build institutions that serve rather than dominate, that adapt rather than stagnate, that remain true to their vision without becoming rigid and brittle. Perhaps, or perhaps we will simply repeat the cycle, building grand organizations that flourish and decay, achieving greatness before succumbing to the same human flaws that doomed their predecessors. Only time will tell, and magic, patient and eternal, will be waiting either way. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the Mages Guild. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Elder Scrolls lore, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of Tamriel's rich history. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the guild, your favorite era of its existence, or which magical institution you would have joined if you lived in Tamriel. Until next time, may your studies be fruitful, your spells be true, and your soul gems remain empty. This is the story of magic in Tamriel, and there are always more secrets to uncover.